Hey, welcome, Jeff Nelson of VetSource. Thanks for tuning in. Today we have back one of our favorite regulars, Dr. Peter Rogers. Welcome, Dr. Rogers.
Hi.
Great to have you here. If you don't know, Dr. Rogers is probably one of the smartest doctors on the planet, certainly among the most trustworthy and honest. He was educated at Stanford and Harvard, where he was at the top of his class. His board scores have always been 99%, and it's no exaggeration to say that he's a genius. He's one of the smartest guys I know, and I know a lot of smart people. So the first video interview that I did with Dr. Rogers was about the brain. And if you want more details about Dr. Rogers' background, I suggest you watch the opening to that video. I'm going to show you what that video is right now. Today, he's going to be talking about the immune system and what you need to know to make sure your immune system is as functional and effective as possible. Now, I have a number of Dr. Rogers' books, which I've talked about in previous videos with him. The one I love, Medical Reformation Vegan Renaissance Bible. I'm going to put links to this book in the description, as well as a link to Peter's YouTube channel, which has an enormous amount of great information. So you're going to want to subscribe to that. All right, well, let's get into the immune system. I'm dying to hear this talk. I don't think anyone has heard this talk, right? This is a brand new talk.
No, I've had a few slides of this before here and there, but the big insight that's going to come, that's new. Okay, you see my first slide?
I sure do.
Okay, so I'd like to start out with a vegan Declaration of Independence from conventional healthcare for chronic disease. Okay, this is the painting, of course, by John Trumbull, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. You might recognize some of these people there. I think you were actually there, Jeff. Hey, a lot of other people you might know. There's McDougall, there's Kempner, there's Campbell, there's Lyle, and then there was a rumor that there was a woman there, but that has not been confirmed.
I love it. There she is, AJ.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that the low-fat, low-sodium, no sofas, vegan diet, those persons never get most of the chronic diseases. We declare independence from these diseases, and we demand lower health insurance premiums, no taxation without representation. And furthermore, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, and to assume the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We declare that not only is the low-fat vegan diet a great option for prevention and treatment of chronic disease, it is the best option by far. Okay, so what are we all hoping for? We're all hoping that there's going to be some fountain of youth. We walk in on one side, fat, weak, and sick and stupid, and we hope to come out on the other side youthful, strong, and sharp and with it. And the closest thing we got to it is, understanding nutrition, toxicology, and a few related things. Because, we're all basically playing chess with death. Okay, here's from the movie Seven Seal, directed by Ingmar Bergman. Okay, so anyways, this is basically, you walk into a new place, you see the map on the wall, you are here. Typical chump takes the pathway of, it's the doctor's job to keep them healthy. And what's the doc? And they eat, the meat, oil, processed food, all the junk. They're just going to put them on a bunch of drugs. That's what they do. Match the old to the pill, send a bill. Drugs don't work so well. End up with surgery, chop, 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 bye-bye money, dead prematurely. The best you can do, I've been studying this for decades, trying to understand. Here's the best you could do is just optimize the diet, avoid toxins, avoid EMF to the extent you can. Get your social, psychosocial, spiritual, religious act together to minimize your stress. And so what I'm saying is man's way is expensive and it doesn't work too well. Sort of this God's way in nature, which our ancestors have done for thousands of years, that works a lot better. Teach others what you learn. I recently heard a good quote from Michelle Chen. She said, be a lighthouse, not a tugboat. Okay, anyways, and then getting into people say, well, what about modern technology? It's coming up with so many treatments and cures. And I'm going to tell you, it is not. The things that are dependent on computers, they have progressed pretty well. But what actually makes you well is the same old story, and that hasn't changed. And there's something called the lamplight fallacy, whereby a scientific researcher only looks where the light is. So this is the old story about the bum who lost his keys. Somebody walks by and says, oh, did you drop your keys under the lamplight? He says, no, I dropped them over here. They go, well, why aren't you looking over there? And he goes, because there's no light over there. And the point of it is, in order to get grant money, all you'll hear these researchers talking about is how they can come up with a new drug. And all the books say the same thing. I'm telling you, all the internal medicine textbooks and all the internal medicine subspecialty books, they're all stupid. They're all a joke. They all say the same thing, almost every single disease. It's associated with aging, seems to be partly associated with genetics. It might be a virus. Take our pill and try to slow it down. They completely ignore all this other stuff because there's no money in it, but there's a lot more treatment capacity in these other things. So that's why you have to learn this for yourself. What essentially they're doing is they're inducing learned helplessness upon the patient. There's a lot of societies, institutions that try to do that. They're basically taking all your power away from you, saying nobody knows what causes it, or it's genetics and getting older. There's nothing you could do about it. Therefore, you got to take our pill. We are the expert. You must accept what we say. And, kind of remind me of school. When I was a kid, I was like looking out the window and, you got to sit there and listen to the teacher you didn't want to listen to. You just want to go play with your friends and stuff. So I won't go into it anymore. But this idea of learned helplessness is important to recognize it when somebody's putting you into it so you can kind of see your way out of it. And so I also joke, don't get me wrong, the Catholic Church has done a lot of good things, but sometimes it overemphasizes its authority. It's St. Peter had the only keys to heaven, and that was the only way to go through the authority, whereas anybody can, there's a lot more to it than that. But I'm just saying that reminds me a little bit of conventional medicine saying, look, we are the experts. We are the legitimate, real experts. No one else is. And this is the only option. Take our pill. And quite often there's better ways of doing things or seeing things. I won't go into all the details there. Here's a generalized way you could kind of estimate your health. Other things being okay. Eat the SAD diet. You're going to start being sick and miserable, usually by about late 40s, early 50s. A lot of women lose their looks very rapidly when they're eating the SAD diet. If they smoke or cigarettes or something like that, then they go even faster down the tubes. Typical healthcare providers often eat some version of a Mediterranean diet. They're about 10 years better off than the SAD diet eaters. But if you look at the Seventh-day Adventist studies where they were the vegans, there's one study where the women lived about 89.6 years, the men about 4 years less than that. Dr. McDougall worked with that population, and he said a lot of those vegans, they were sort of, religious Seventh-day Adventist vegans. They weren't really health vegans. And he predicted that people could live, a significant bit more than that. So I just added a couple of years here. But that's about how you could do, all other things being equal. And there's the idea of a lifespan. And this line kind of indicates a health span. You're healthy enough still to work and carry out your hobbies. A lot of people spend their last, 10, 15 years really sick, not able to do too much. And that's kind of sad for them. And it kind of comes down to this idea of a video game. This is like Super Mario Brothers, and most video games are similar. The character walks through an obstacle course, and if they screw up, they lose energy points. If they go and do the right thing, they gain energy points. So you want to know what's good for you. So we'll talk about that in this lecture, but here's a brief list. A lot of stuff we talked about before, so do the good stuff, avoid the bad stuff, and you'll get the best possible outcome. A little bit interesting. Here's this lady. Her name is Elizabeth Blackburn. She won a Nobel Prize for discovering the telomerase enzyme that makes telomeres. Telomeres are the little tips of the chromosomes. They're like the cap on the shoelace. And every time a cell divides, the DNA polymerase can't get all the way to the edge, so it loses a couple of base pairs, and the chromosome progressively shortens with each repeat cell division. Eventually, the shortening starts to encroach upon genes that are needed by the cell to live. And once that happens, the cell gradually just dies. It can no longer make those proteins. That's called the Hayflick limit, because there was a researcher named Leonard Hayflick working with human tissue cultures, and he noticed that typical human body somatic cells, that just means routine cells, not your stem cells, because they've got telomeres, they can keep going, not your germ cells, but your just routine, most of your body cells, they're only going to get about 60 divisions. So you don't want to accelerate that unnecessarily. Okay, so things that accelerate that, which means through activation of mTOR. I'm going to talk about all that in a moment. It'll make more sense if this is new to you. But you don't want to do stuff that accelerates shortening your telomeres. Okay, these are the telomeres, and you don't want to shorten those unnecessarily. And she talks about, especially psychological stress would shorten telomeres. So you don't want to do that. And she was measuring them in white blood cells, which is interesting because white blood cells are your immune system. Okay, they protect you from infections. They protect you from cancer. And what I've seen is if you go to any Western hospital, it's pretty much the same everywhere. In the morning, outside the front door, there's like a river of all these fat, hypertensive diabetics that flow into the place. And a lot of them are kind of enthusiastic. They walk around kind of like, like a deer caught in the headlights. Oh, this magnificent giant building. Wow, all this technology. Isn't this hospital impressive? And it reminds me of, going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury Tales. People now think, science is like religion or something. They don't understand it's really a big joke, but they think it's real. And so what happens is they're all going for CAT scans, ultrasounds, MRI, blood tests, colonoscopy, you name it, a whole bunch of tests. And what I'm trying to say is you don't cure a disease by taking a picture of it, okay? You get a chest x-ray. That doesn't cure you of a lung problem or a cardiac problem. You cure a disease by having your organs in your body well nourished. Every single thing in your body functions better when you have good blood flow. Well, what provides good blood flow? Low fat, low sodium, whole food, plant diet. So that's why it works. It's the species specific diet to optimize health in humans. Okay. And it's something as simple as that should be known. We're also going to talk about your immune system. Your immune system basically fights for you. All right. So you want to take care of your immune system so that it will protect you from infections and from cancer. And there's more to it than that, but that's a good concept for starters. And here we're looking at, let me see if I can move this thing here. One of my friends said to me, what good is it to know all this stuff? Now we're old and most of the people we love, they all are dead already. What the heck good is all this knowledge? And I'm like, well, I still got some loved ones alive. And, it's nice to teach the younger generation, to help them and let them help others. And there's sort of a ripple effect that extends outward. And so I like these chivalry paintings that kind of remind me there's something good and noble about it. This is The Accolade by Edmund Layton. He was an awesome painter from the late 1800s. Godspeed, Edmund Layton. He was sort of a disciple of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood school of painters. And there was really this magnificent movement in the late 1800s. You would call it perhaps the Victorian Renaissance. There was also Catholic revival in there. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but there was magnificent art in the late 1800s. Okay, anyway, so the question might arise, how did I get interested in studying the immune system? What happened? What motivated me to start reading about this again? And it came from looking at these necks. I do a lot of neck biopsies. My background is, I did a surgical internship, general diagnostic radiology, imaging guided surgery fellowship, and I also did a neuro fellowship. I almost did an endovascular neurosurgery fellowship. I did half of one, but I realized that's been taken over by neurosurgery. So anyways, the reason I'm showing this is I've done hundreds and hundreds, over 1,000 neck biopsies. And so whenever there's something weird in the neck, people come to me. And there was a criteria for the different spaces of the lymph nodes in the neck, coming out of the New York ENT surgery group and Peter Sam. And basically, if the lymph node is big, people get worried that it's cancer or an infection, and they come to me and I have to biopsy it. And the thing is, all the criteria were based on old people that had squamous cell cancer, head and neck cancer. But I would keep getting all these young patients sent to me, and they would meet the criteria. Their lymph nodes were big, but there was nothing wrong with them. And what I'm getting at is young people have much bigger lymph nodes than old people do. So as people get older, their immune system starts to atrophy. And as it starts to atrophy, they're more vulnerable to cancer and infections. So I was wondering, why does it atrophy? Is there anything that can be done to control the rate at which the immune system atrophies? Okay. And I tried talking to a bunch of pathologists and, they gave me a little feedback, but they really didn't know much about it. One of them said he thought it was the whole mTOR Hayflick stuff we just referred to. And I also know, of course, that cortisol shuts off the immune system. And cortisol is like the main hormone of the stress response. And what's that all about? You remember the stress response is memorized, taught to students being chased by a tiger in the dark. So if the tiger's chasing you, all you care about is surviving the next 20 minutes. Climb a tree, hide, do something. Okay, so when the immune system's activated, you have to utilize the body resources, whatever energy is available, the glucose, for example, in the blood, and put it all into the muscles. Run, save your life. Okay, so it's like hitting a switch, and it switches off the immune system. So that worked well for our ancestors who just had to survive, the next 20 minutes running from a saber-toothed tiger. But it's a problem in the modern world because a lot of times people are psychologically stressed out about some emotional thing, a work-related thing, a relationship, whatever it might be. And because they're stressed out, they keep prolonged elevated cortisol. And then that has a bit of an insomnia effect. It's really sort of the opposite of melatonin. It's also kind of the opposite of oxytocin, the love hormone. Melatonin is the sleep hormone. Cortisol is like a seesaw with both of them. And then the person doesn't sleep well. They get insomnia from that. Well, once they have insomnia, what does sleep deprivation do? Elevates more cortisol, elevates the same hormones as stress. And they go, gee, I'm tired. I'm stressed out. I think I'll have a cup of coffee. Elevates the same hormone. So caffeine, sleep deprivation, and stress are all kind of the same thing in terms of the hormone elevation. So they all shut off the immune system. That's a dangerous thing to do, to be having the immune system shut off for a real prolonged amount of time, because it's your immune system that protects you from cancer. Okay, it also protects you from infection. In addition, I'll explain a little bit in a moment about how increased dietary salt weakens your immune system, decreases your ability to protect yourself from cancer, and our estrogenic chemicals, there's a ton of them in the environment, and they're also damaging to the immune system. And this was kind of coupled in with another observation. I have a lady doctor friend who did some of her training in an area next to a big Chinatown in a city. And she had noticed the senior doctors in a group were talking about all these old Chinese people. Look at these brains. Why do these brains look so good? A lot of these old Japanese people had real tight brains. We call a brain tight when the brain parenchyma, the brain tissue, is up tight against the skull. What I see all day long is I look at a lot of people with cognitive impairment, and I look at their brain MRIs. Oops, I kind of jumped a slide. I'm trying to move this toolbar out of here. So this is a big cerebral spinal fluid space here. And sorry, I keep jumping out of that slide. Big cerebral spinal fluid space here. And this is an atrophic brain. So I've seen many thousands of demented, cognitively impaired demented brains. By far, the most common thing I see is this: an atrophic brain, meaning a shrunken brain, meaning that it's lost a lot of brain cells, and it does not fit any characteristic pattern. In a previous lecture, I talked about why I think Alzheimer's is a joke. I think it's just silliness. Okay, these are good theories. The Jack Del Torre theory, that's the mouse equivalent theory, vascular hypothesis of dementia. Lots of people are demented from traumatic brain injury, CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The thing that was funny about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, everybody's so impressed by the big Boston blood bank where they do autopsies on their brains after they're dead. But while they're alive, I'm not going to say any particular person, but a lot of these so-called Boston highly educated persons recommend the Mediterranean diet, which is absolutely stupid. So it's a bad diet for the brain. But I won't go into that anymore. A clever guy out of Japan, Tetsumori Yamashima, doctor, he was tasked with, why are so many Japanese people becoming demented? Their rates of dementia are going way up. And he figured out, in his opinion, the main factor was eating more omega-6 oils, and that's the whole lipid peroxidation, producing toxic aldehydes, hydroxynonenal, and the hydroxynonenal leading to mitochondrial toxicity. And then it's a whole long story, but it activates calpain-cathepsin, these protease enzymes that just destroy the cell. They cause the brain cells to go into apoptosis, like I've shown you, and you end up with a shrunken atrophic brain. There's a beta amyloid theory, which is partly tied to Alzheimer's, but there's another angle on it, which I won't get into. And then there's my theory of neurovascular uncoupling, which I'll briefly allude to later, but that's a big part of why these people are getting stupid. And the reason why I'm sharing this all together is we're going to see how all of these things will connect in just a moment. I'll explain to you. And the good news is I'm going to explain to you ways that you can dramatically reduce your risk of all this stuff. So, you're going to run into people who say, well, how do you know low-fat vegan diet's better? And you've got the argument of epidemiology. Well, gee, in the plant-based communities, the people are skinny and healthy, whereas in the meat and processed food communities, they're all fat and sick. And people will say, well, are you so sure? What about this? What about that? And I'll just tell you, look at a blood test. If you do the blood test, the plant-based eater, their blood test is better in every way. They have a lower white blood cell count, less systemic inflammation. Okay, less C-reactive protein, which is partly a marker of inflammation. It's actually a marker a little bit also of not being able to replenish glycogen storage. So it's really indirectly a marker as well of insulin resistance, both bad. There's also an acute phase reactant protein. They'll have more higher total cholesterol. All the meat eaters, they're bad on everything. Total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, more hypertension, more triglycerides in the blood, more VLDL, more insulin-like growth factor. Everything bad. Higher hemoglobin A1Cs. You get everything better when you go low-fat, low-sodium, plant-based, okay? And also the fiber protects you from leaky gut, which then protects you from postprandial endotoxemia, bacterial LPS, which is prothrombotic, predisposes you to clotting, increases your risk of heart attack, stroke, and cognitive impairment. So anyways, people say to me, well, what are the problems with vegan? There has to be a problem. Of course you do. You end up needing most people to take vitamin B12. I take methylcobalamin. I would never take cyanocobalamin. I take methylcobalamin. Okay, and I say, here's some of the problems. Well, a lot of times the person who's going low-fat vegan, if their spouse doesn't go, then they get all skinny and good-looking, and their spouse gets jealous. This is a painting called Echo and Narcissus. She was a nymph who had actually, she had ticked off Hera, the wife of Zeus, because she had helped Zeus to philander with one of her friends. So that, and Hera wouldn't let her speak normally again. She could just echo. This was Narcissus, who fell in love with his reflection. And there's different versions of the story, but one of them is that he couldn't stop looking at himself and he starved to death. But be that as it may, this is a paper written recommending they change the white blood cell count, what is considered normal. So for meat and processed food eaters, 4.5 to 11 is considered a normal white blood cell count. But for plant eaters, it's probably more like 3 to 9. They just have less systemic inflammation. And I saw an interesting talk from Dr. McDougall. He was talking about this theory by Alan Cunningham that eating a meat diet causes so much systemic inflammation, on a daily basis. It's overstimulating the immune system, and some of the immune systems sort of break out of a controlled pattern and become a cancer. A lymphoma is a cancer of lymphocytes, a cancer of lymph nodes. When you look at a CAT scan of a lymphoma patient, there's all these giant cannonball, big honking lymph nodes all over the place. Okay, so that is the overstimulation theory of cancer causation in the immune system. Another example is Burkitt's lymphoma due to chronic overstimulation by the malaria parasite in companies. And Dennis Burkitt, the same guy who figured out abdominal pressure syndrome, he figured out Burkitt's lymphoma. There's a great biography of him. Gosh, I think the author's name was Ethel something. It was really good. It was a great story. He was an incredible nutrition medical hero, that guy, Dennis Burkitt. Okay, another thing, this was McDougall showing some of the papers in his lecture. Vegetables, prevent lymphoma. People eat the plant-based diet, especially the veggies, have the strongest correlation with lowering the white blood cell count, protecting the immune system. Then something interesting came out of the True North work where they had a patient with a lymphoma. They went on a water fast, and this was for 21 days. And afterwards, the lymph nodes were substantially reduced in size, and the patient came back for, a 9-month follow-up, and the nodes were still not palpable, hadn't significantly enlarged. That's pretty encouraging. A lot less side effects going on a fast, eating low-fat vegan than there are, taking chemo. And don't get me wrong, this is only one anecdotal case. Yeah, fine. But it's the kind of thing that should be followed up on, not ignored. Okay, now here's an interesting lady. Her name is Lydia Lynch. She's an Irish lady who ended up at Harvard studying immunology. And she somehow got in the idea of studying it with relationship to food. She fed the mice. This is work done on mice, but every single type of fat that she could feed them the mice always got fat. That's why I don't care if somebody tells you that this is special magic fat. Because this fat is from a nut, it won't cause obesity. Because this fat is from an omega-3 supplement, it won't cause obesity. But no, all the fats caused obesity. And Blankenhorn had some similar results. They were all atherogenic, promoting coronary artery disease. I don't buy the magic fat argument. Okay, what does this metabolic paralysis mean for the immune system? Okay, so Lydia Lynch and her group, they showed that, when the person eats a high-fat diet, or if they're just obese, because they get what's called, adipocyte spillover, some fat leaks into the blood, so to speak, they have elevated blood lipids. She's noticed that it would paralyze the NK cells. NKs are natural killer cells. They're a lymphocyte, even though they're really part of the innate immune system. They don't have memory like the other lymphocytes do. And also the cytotoxic T cells, the CD8 cells. So that's a rather shocking statement. And she said when they fed the high-fat diet to the cancer mice, they all had increased progression of cancer. I thought that was rather amusing too, because there's a lot of people trying to say keto diet is some good diet for cancer. In my opinion, from what I read, it sounds totally stupid, okay? There's multiple reasons why I say that, and other people discuss that in this talk. I'll show you some of them, but I think the whole keto, carnivore, low-carb diet thing is all for chumps. I don't see any rationale behind it. Okay, here's Neil Bernard. He made an interesting quote. He said, the immune system can't work in an oil slick, which is fat. Fat is oil, okay? So that's interesting. And it's also interesting, this Lydia Lynch coming up with this, because she's coming at this totally from this research point of view. They've got nothing to do with the nutrition community. But what I see happening is there's the formation of a new field of scientific researchers. They call themselves immuno for immune system, metabolism for the effect of food. And of course, they're always going to have to recommend, say, we might discover a drug, because otherwise they won't get funding. But it's still interesting that they're messing around with diets and showing the effect of diets. So basically, normally a natural killer cell has to form a strong attachment to the target cell, let's say a cancer cell or a bacteria or something, and it's not able to do this when they eat high-fat diet. They got high blood lipids. So again, here's another slide from Lydia Lynch, and she's showing when there's increased free fatty acids in the blood due to obesity, due to high dietary fat, the immune system is weakened. You shut off the cells that are doing the work, the natural killer cells, part of the innate immune system, and you shut off the CD8 cells, which are also called cytotoxic T cells. I have a trick for remembering stuff. For everything I had to remember in school, what I always do is make up some visual trick. So I know a CD8 is a killer cell. So what I would do is I'd imagine a line here, like a knife, cutting the 8 in half, and then I can remember it looks like a K. And that's how I know that that's a killer cell too. But there one is innate system. This is the adaptive system, meaning the adaptive system has memory. The innate system does not. Okay, so anyways, it shuts off the part of your immune system that fights for you, and it activates the Tregs. Tregs are T regulator cells that suppress the immune system. And there are times when that's good. You don't want the immune system attacking itself. You don't want the immune system causing increased trouble in your gut for no reason. So you do need Tregs, but you get an excessive activation of your Tregs at the wrong time. All right. And then the tumors grow faster. So she is saying, this is coming out of totally objective research where they could care less about nutrition, saying being fat and eating high fat diets is a no-no, bad for your immune system. Going to make you more vulnerable to infections and more vulnerable to cancer. Now, here's another guy. Just, I sort of randomly came across these guys when I was trying to understand the immune system. This guy's name is Luke O'Neill at Trinity College, Dublin. And he says, mitochondria are in the center of everything. When we get dysfunctional mitochondria, it's given us more problems with diabetes. It's given us more problems with autoimmune disease, and it's screwing up the immune system. Well, gee, that's pretty interesting. The mitochondria keep ending up in the middle of all these problems. And I had read some interesting things in the past. I was interested in a lot of things. I was interested primarily initially, in metabolism. Then I was interested in cancer. I was also interested in origin of life, biochemistry. And this is Krebs' cycle. Krebs' cycle is in the center of the mitochondria. It's called the mitochondrial matrix. And it's really the center of all metabolism. Normally, Krebs' cycle runs in a clockwise manner, and it's used to generate electron carriers that go to the inner mitochondrial membrane. You use them to make ATP. ATP means adenosine triphosphate, tri as in 3 phosphates on it. And that's basically money in a cell. It's like $20 bill. That is the energy of a cell to do all the work a cell does. So clockwise TCA, it's also called tricarboxylic cycle. It's called the citric acid cycle, and it's called Krebs cycle. They're all the same thing. Citrate is why it's called citric acid cycle as well. Krebs is the name of the guy who discovered it. All right. So anyways, what I had learned that was rather interesting when I studied cancer is during cancer, Krebs cycle can run backwards. Because a healthy cell, it wants to make energy, so it can do work. Most healthy cells are basically like manual labor, hardworking blue-collar cells, okay? They bust their tail all day long trying to do whatever they're supposed to do, their job in an organ, okay? If you're working the liver, you got a lot of work to do. You got to maintain blood glucose level. You got to build glycogen, break down glycogen, run gluconeogenesis, maintain blood glucose level for the brain, detoxify all the stuff. So there's a lot of work to do. When you're a cancer cell, it's like, screw it. I'm not doing any work. I don't have enough energy. My mitochondria is not working so well. I'm just going to try to reproduce. Take this job and shove it. I'm going to go find another place to live. That's metastasis. Okay, so anyways, Krebs cycle runs backwards for biosynthesis reasons and other reasons in cancer. That's an important point. We'll come back to that, but then here's the work of Luke O'Neill, this biochemistry researcher from Trinity College, Dublin. He goes, you know what? During the middle of active infection, the Krebs cycle blocks a couple enzymes, and it blocks the enzyme right here beyond aconitase, so it can make this side molecule itaconate. And this one basically is very antibacterial, okay? And then it'll also stop another step in the cycle to get what it wants out of there. So what I'm trying to say is the mitochondria are in the center of this. So basically, if you want to be healthy, you want to live in such a way your mitochondria will function well. And in order to make sense out of mitochondria, we're going to have to take a quick step backwards to the origin of life to make things make sense. Okay, so here it is. The big man, the big God, he created the sun and the earth, painted by Michelangelo, 1509. Here's from the Gospel according to John, chapter 1, verse 1-5. In the beginning, the Word was God, and the Word was God. Okay, was with God and was God. All things were made by him, and without him, not anything was made. And the light shineth in the darkness. Okay, so I tell you that. It's going to be relevant here. Here's the life timeline. There was no life in Italy. Earth was supposedly formed 4.6 billion years ago. I don't know for sure if that's correct, but that's the standard. Okay, and then gradually life came onto the planet, let's say around 3 billion years ago, something like that. And then eventually, initially it was all anaerobic, no oxygen. And then gradually there's started to be some photosynthesis. Some bacteria, got that ability. And they started making a little bit of oxygen, but the oxygen was intermittent. That's an important point. The oxygen was intermittent. Okay, that you got to know that. And it wasn't until later that the world sort of stabilized, and about 21% of air is oxygen at sea level. Okay, and then you could get these multicellular big animals. All right. So here's photosynthesis. Sunshine comes into the plant, gives it energy. Carbon dioxide, the gray is the carbon dioxide as in two oxygens, the red is the oxygen, and it takes that and it makes them into sugar, to glucose, okay? And then it gives off oxygen, which we humans breathe. So we have a symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship with the plants. And it also takes water in there, okay, and gets nutrients from the soil. Okay, so this lady did some interesting work here, Lynn Margulis. She was a pioneer of what is called endosymbiosis theory. So endosymbiosis theory means you basically had these anaerobic bacteria, and then these little mitochondria bacteria. It was a bacteria originally, evolved to be able to make energy out of oxygen. These were anaerobic, and they phagocytized, means they ate the mitochondria, and usually they would just digest it and eat it. But somehow this just happened, a 1 in a billion probabilities, and the mitochondria survived inside of the bacteria. And then it kept on producing all this ATP in the bacteria for energy. And the bacteria is like, hey, this is a good deal. And that bacteria replicated and took over the whole planet. Okay, that's the story of mitochondria. There was one event, and then that was such a successful strategy for life that it took over the planet. Plants got chloroplasts as well for photosynthesis. It's kind of like having a solar panel for energy, and you don't have to go around eating stuff. Okay, so anyways, that is the endosymbiosis theory. Pretty well confirmed now of how mitochondria got inside of bacteria, and this led to all your eukaryotic cells. The big difference between a prokaryote, pro means before, karyote means like nut, really they use it to mean nucleus. And so bacteria are prokaryotes, and once it got a mitochondria, it became a eukaryote, which they say is the nut related to the nucleus, but really the important thing is the mitochondria. Okay, so that's an important point. Oxygen availability was originally intermittent, meaning that the early life forms, that even if they had a mitochondria, they still maintain some of their old machinery, their old biosynthesis, metabolic pathways, that if oxygen was short, they go, oh, got to switch back into the old method, anaerobic glycolysis, so they could survive with a lack of oxygen. That's a very important point. We're going to come back to that. Tells us a lot about cell function and a lot about cancer, and it's going to tell us a lot about the immune system. Okay, so here's the next painting of God creating the animals, and this couldn't happen, of course, until they had oxidative metabolism with mitochondria, because you need to generate lots of energy to create a big animal. Okay, here is God created in man's image, that man is part divine as well as part beast, and it's a pretty important concept because for everybody to get along, it's a good idea that we're all at least part divine. The nice quote from Arnold Toynbee, the great English historian. He said, "The brotherhood of man presupposes the fatherhood of God," and I think that's true. It says we're all in this together. Let's help each other. Okay, another thing too is I sometimes run into people who said, oh, I'm not scientific. Let me tell you something. Okay, I was an A+ student in evolutionary biology at Stanford. I read about 50 books on the subject since that time. And I can tell you, you cannot explain the origin of life, the origin of complexity without a God-based worldview. It's just too complicated. If you go to the beach and you were to see your name written in the sand, okay, you would say, an intelligent, literate person wrote my name. You wouldn't think the water scribbled your name, okay? So then ask yourself, how could the human genome, 3.3 billion base pairs, perfectly organized, of the most complicated chemistry you could imagine, spontaneously happened? We have no way to explain it, okay? There really isn't a way to explain it, okay? And here's Michael Crichton. He was the famous writer. He wrote Jurassic Park. He's a Harvard-trained physician. He said, human embryology is so complicated, we can barely describe it, yet alone understand it. Yeah, now here's another interesting guy related to all this. This is Otto Warburg. He won the Nobel Prize in 1931. He's the guy who the Warburg effect, he figured it out. It's named after him. Basically, when you deplete oxygen in a cell, you cause hypoxia. You can injure the cell's mitochondria, and the cell will shift over to, many of the cells will die, but some of the cells will be turned into cancer. Well, they'll shift over to a predominantly anaerobic metabolism running on glucose. That's why cancer cells, you can do a PET scan, fluorodeoxyglucose test, because they take up 100 times more glucose than a regular cell. And they have very little residual function in mitochondria typically. There's more to it than that. I don't want to get into all the pathophysiology of it, but the important point was, Instead of dying like most cells do, the cell will shift into anaerobic metabolism primarily to survive in a low oxygen environment. And okay, everybody gets that. If you look at the work of Royce Swank, okay, he was, feeding humans and animals high-fat diets, and he found that when he fed, there was a work of Peter Quo, he showed 15 to 20% drop in oxygen delivery to tissues with a high-fat meal. He was actually mixing in salt there too. But Royce Swank had cases where he was dropping oxygen delivery by 35% to tissues in the brain of a hamster. And so what I'm saying is, you've already got a big drop in oxygen. Warburg was able to start getting that effect at about a 35% drop in oxygen. Well, guess what? Let's throw in some mitochondrial inhibitors. Tylenol is a mitochondrial inhibitor. Statins are mitochondrial inhibitors. SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are mitochondrial inhibitors. Fungal mold prevention inhibitors are put into processed food all the time, so it doesn't get mold growing in it, so it doesn't get returned to the store. Those are mitochondrial inhibitors. You pile up these mitochondrial inhibitors, you're going to have a similar effect, it seems, to dropping that oxygen tension delivery down, so the cell can't make ATP. When the cell can't make ATP, it can't fix itself, it can't defend itself, it can't function. Okay, and this guy out of Warburg was pretty cool. He's considered the greatest biochemist of the 1900s by many people. He trained Walter Kempner. Okay, he also trained Hans Krebs, the guy who figured out the Krebs cycle that we've just been talking about. And he won Nobel Prize, Krebs won Nobel Prize, Kempner deserved the Nobel Prize, but they'll never give it to a nutrition guy. Notice how none of these superstar nutrition guys get Nobel Prizes. They want to keep this information hidden from the public. If the public learned all this stuff and became skinny and healthy, where would the money go for the big drug companies? Okay, I'm a 60-year-old low-fat, low-sodium vegan. I don't have any medical problems. I don't take any pills. Everything works. All right, now here's a little bit about what's the deal with normal cell versus cancer. So first of all, here's our original cell, the anaerobic bacteria. Uses tons of glucose, converts it into pyruvate lactic acid. Okay, that's like if you run a sprint, you get the lactic acid burn. A normal cell is a worker. Like I said, it's a laborer, a manual laborer, blue-collar guy just busting his tail all day long. It needs tons of energy, tons of ATP to do work. Cancer cell is not like that. Cancer cell is not making much energy off mitochondria. It's running a bunch of biosynthesis pathways. By the way, it can run Krebs cycle off glutamine. So glutamine is a very abundant amino acid, protein, and it can run this all off of that. So that's why, to me, this whole idea of reducing sugar in a cancer patient is kind of a joke. Okay, glutamine is going to come in the back door no matter what. So you better not make that the focus of your treatment. Anyways, we won't go into that in any more detail today. One of the things the cancer cell does is when it goes from glucose to pyruvate, converts it to lactate, it pumps protons into the extracellular matrix. So it pumps acid into the extracellular matrix, meaning the space around the cell, and increasing the acidity, the number of protons in the extracellular matrix. The cancer cell is competing with the cells right next to it, the normal cells. And it's also trying to hide from the immune system. When it throws protons into its vicinity, it makes it like a moat of acid around itself. That shuts off the immune system. Okay, so that's important to know. Acid shuts off the immune system. All right, so does stress. We talked about that. So that's something you don't want. That's one of the reasons why it's beneficial to eat a plant-based diet. It's more alkaline, like your fruits and vegetables, for example, compared to the meat. Meat has a lot more sulfur-containing amino acids like methionine and cysteine, and part of their metabolism is to be converted into sulfuric acid, inducing a metabolic acidosis. Sodium also does it. The more sodium chloride salt you put on your food, the chloride will have a tendency to displace bicarbonate ions from the blood, which is a pH buffer, leading to a low-grade metabolic acidosis. Again, pushing things in an unfavorable direction. You don't want to do that. And also eating low protein is beneficial. What is protein? It's made out of amino acids. Amino acids. It's acidic, okay? The more amino acids you eat, the more acidity. Okay, here's a point about tumors, that a 1 gram tumor, so something like, the size of my little fingernail, will shed into the blood. A cancer cell can shed easily 1 million cancer cells into the blood in 1 day. So here's the paper if you want to look it up. So what's the point? Who do you think removes those cancer cells? They either die because they can't latch onto something. I'll explain what that's all about. Or the immune system will remove them. And McDougall gave a nice lecture about this one time where he's talking about by the time we can see a cancer, it's usually about 1 centimeter. For example, in the lung, if it's a bigger centimeter or bigger, we say it's probably cancer. We'll get a PET scan. If it's hot, it's a cancer, almost always, okay? On the other hand, once it's smaller than 10 millimeters, you can't see it on a PET scan typically, Okay. So there's a lot of situations where when they're small, we typically describe them as there's a small lung nodule, indeterminate significance, follow-up CT scan recommended in 6 months. So you don't know. Most of the time, you don't know until it's about a centimeter in diameter with a growing possible cancer. All right. In the liver, they're typically described as, too small to characterize. Same thing in the kidney, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So what's my point? By the time you can see the thing and make a diagnosis, most of the time it's already metastatic. Well, if it's already metastatic, what do you think is going to keep you alive? That your immune system is hustling and doing its job and controlling that cancer. So you want to control your immune system. You need to control your immune system. You need to make it good as you can. All right, so here's the cancer. Here's like base camp for the cancer. It's hanging out in here. Here's the cancer stem cells. Those are the baddies, the ones that are probably going to kill you if you don't do what you can to prevent them. So what'll happen too, a lot of times people get chemo or something, and it'll take out most of the tumor, but it will not finish off the cancer stem cells. So it'll be like maybe 1 year, 2 years later, the cancer will come roaring back, and it'll be more aggressive. It'll have transformed itself, having a little bit of a different genetic profile, so to speak, and it'll be more aggressive, just kills the patient, okay? And the immune system now has been weakened from the previous chemo. That's one of the weaknesses of it. So like I was saying, it's pumping out protons all around into the matrix around here, suppressing the immune system and helping it to outcompete the surrounding cells. It'll do well with hypoxia. That sort of helps it to outcompete the surrounding cells. It does well in an acidic environment. That's called the tumor microenvironment or the tumor milieu, okay? So what you want is good immune cells. Take care of your knights so they're ready to fight for you. All right. And you need your immune system. Here's a slide from that paper saying low pH in the tumor microenvironment works as a global protection shield for tumor cells. Global protection shield for tumor cells. It shuts off your immune system. Your natural killer cells, they can't fight. Okay. Your cytotoxic T cells, they can't fight when they're in this acidic environment. All right, and now I'm going to talk about something that seems different, but it's going to be related. I'm going to talk briefly about the role of calcium in a cell. In a cell, you've got some different ions, like the three big ones are sodium, potassium, and magnesium. As the four ones, magnesium and calcium. And this is a drawing showing that all roads lead to Rome, okay? In the ancient world, in that area, the Mediterranean, all roads lead to Rome. When it comes to what's going on in the cell, all roads lead to calcium. And if you want to be intelligent about pathophysiology, you should know this. All roads lead to calcium. So sodium, potassium, magnesium, those are minimum wage workers. Follow orders, do what you're told to do, and they bust their tail all day long working. Calcium is the aristocrat. Calcium comes in and says, do this now. So calcium is the big dog in terms of making the cell do stuff. You need to know that. Calcium is like turning a light on and off. All right. So it's very important that the cell has a tight control on what calcium does. All these things lead to increased calcium in the cell. Traumatic brain injury, EMF, cell phones, Wi-Fi. They open up voltage-gated calcium channels, letting more calcium flow into the cytoplasm. Okay. Stimulants will crank this up. MSG on processed food, MFG, manufactured free glutamate, the sweetener, aspartame, okay? The herbicide sprayed on non-GMO soy, GP, glyphosate, okay? Glutamate itself, that's what glue means. Aspartame, stimulants, okay? A lot of things, caffeine, psychological stress, they're all pushing up calcium, and that means they're ramping up the metabolic rate of that neuron. Well, if you ramp up the metabolic rate of that neuron, you better be able to supply adequate ATP. It means your mitochondria needs to be working well. It means you got to have good oxygen and glucose delivery to that cell. It means that your calcium management system includes something called SERCA, sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase. That's really your endoplasmic reticulum is a calcium reservoir. It all has to work so you can keep calcium under control and it doesn't overwhelm your neuron. And if you don't do that, you end up like this Van Halen song. I think that you're headed for a whole lot of trouble. Because I see all these people, you ask any doctor, just go up to any doctor and ask them, what do you typically see in your patients over 60? And even a lot of them just over 50, they're sort of overweight, hypertensive, diabetic, and cognitively slow. They've lost that vitality, that nuance to handle subtle, complex thought, jokes, metaphors, and stuff. So they're not doing too well, okay? And most of them have a zero chance of getting better. The reason I say zero chance, I'm not trying to be mean, I'm just stating the facts. If you put a patient on a pill for hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, they never get better. They take that pill the rest of their life until they progressively get sicker and die. Their only hope is that they have enough intellectual wherewithal to learn about this stuff and turn things around. That's the only chance of a cure. It's a dietary disease. No medical, surgical bullshitology can fix it other than to fix the diet and to avoid the toxins, okay? To get one sleep, all the stuff I just talked to you about. The stuff that's been around for thousands of years for our ancestors could have done it if they'd known it consciously. Anyways, so here's how a cell works. You've got a potassium sodium ATP pump, and you're pumping in 2 positive charge, you're pumping out 3 positive. So you're pumping out more positive charge than coming into the cell. That creates a electrical negative charge inside the cell, about negative 65 millivolts. Because you're pumping out more sodium, you have higher sodium outside the cell. The gradient in terms of concentration of sodium is about 10-to-1 outside the cell. So that's an electric gradient and a chemical concentration gradient. We call it an electrochemical gradient of sodium. What that means is sodium wants to come into the cell. It wants to come into the cell to equilibrate its electrical gradient and its concentration gradient. And the fact that sodium wants to come into the cell means you can take that energy, you can allow a few sodium into the cell and couple that to doing something else. So you go, okay, sodium, I'll let you bring in 3 of you, okay? And boom, I can use that to pump out calcium because you've got to control calcium. Calcium is really the priority. Sodium is just, a worker bee, okay, to get stuff done. That's an important point. You need magnesium to run the ATP pumps. That's why you need magnesium. You need adequate amounts of potassium to make these pumps work, okay? Most people are eating way too much sodium, not enough potassium, not enough magnesium, which I'll show its role here in just a moment, and that messes up their plasma membrane pumps. This pump is essentially an electrical battery, okay? The human life figured out electricity and all this stuff, millions of years before humans did, however long humans have been around. Calcium makes the cell do whatever it does. Like in a brain cell, it makes it release a neurotransmitter, okay? All right, so here's a little bit more detailed drawing. The point of this is that when you want to get calcium down in the cytoplasm, you've got like 3 main options. You can pump it out of the cell into the extracellular matrix, okay? You could pump it, also this is a slower pump. The plasma membrane calcium ATPase is slower than the NACA. Na means natrium in Latin, and that's the word for sodium. K means kalium, and that's the word for potassium, okay? So anyways, because the potassium concentration gradient is so high outside the cell, it's like 10,000 to 15,000 times higher than it is inside the cell, you always have to pump against a gradient. Whenever you're pumping against a gradient, that means you need energy, you need ATP. And because you need ATP, what does that mean? It means you need mitochondria. Mitochondria are making most of the ATP in the cell. So you have to have good mitochondrial function or you can't get the calcium out of the cell. You can also pump calcium into the endoplasmic reticulum. The S really is a holdover from muscles where it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And it's really the endoplasmic reticulum. And then the pump used to pump calcium is called the calcium ATPase. So the whole thing's abbreviated CIRCA. Okay, so this is a CIRCA pump to pump calcium in there so it can be stored in that endoplasmic reticulum because you got to be able to drop that calcium concentration real fast. Otherwise, the cell would keep on releasing neurotransmitter. You don't want that. Okay, so in a sense, imagine you're in a rowboat and you've got a hole in the boat, and so water keeps coming into the boat. You can keep bailing the water out of the boat, and you better keep bailing that water out of the boat fast. And let's just say you can't fix the leak in this particular example. If you can't bail that water out adequately, you're screwed. Boat sinks, cell dies. All right, that's apoptosis of a cell when it happens gradually. All right, so that's an important point. Okay, here's a little bit about mitochondria. Mitochondria is about this, looks like a little peanut. It has an outer membrane called the outer mitochondrial membrane, usually abbreviated OMM. It has an inner membrane, this green one right here, and that's abbreviated IMM for inner mitochondrial membrane. That's where everything happens, on the inner mitochondrial membrane. That's where ATP is made. Okay, in the center of it, that's called the mitochondrial matrix, and that's where Krebs cycle runs, which we showed earlier. Okay, there's a little space between the outer mitochondrial membrane and the inner mitochondrial membrane, and that's called the intramembranous space. And that's where protons are pumped. We're going to be pumping protons into this space. It'll make sense in a moment. And once we build up a proton gradient in here, that can be coupled to making ATP. I'll show you how that works in a moment. Here's how it basically works. The mitochondria, like I said, it's beyond genius level. They split the atom. They split the hydrogen atom, and they take the proton component, the positive charge, and they pump that into the membranous space. And now they've stolen an electron from it, and the electrons they hand off. They pass them from one carrier to the next. This is carrier number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. and they will just hand off these electrons. It's like rolling a snowball down a hill. And progressively, you have a progressively stronger electronegativity, a progressively stronger desire to grab that electron as you move from complex 1 to complex 4. And then the ultimate electron acceptor is oxygen. Oxygen has a super high electronegativity. The only element that's more electronegative than oxygen is fluoride, okay? And that's a major toxin, okay? But oxygen wants to grab those electrons. And so this electrons just run down here, and then the energy of the electron sort of running downhill as it's handed off from one carrier to the next of the fireman bucket brigade is a proton is pumped into the intramembranous space. So H plus is a proton. So proton pump, proton pump, proton pump. And then at the end of the line, complex 5 is ATP synthase, which harvests the gradient. You can think of it as being like an air pressure, air under pressure. You can let the air out real fast. And once that proton comes back into the matrix, which it strongly wants to do, that spins the ATP synthase, which enables coupling of a phosphate to be added to ADP, adenosine diphosphate with 2 phosphates to make it into ATP with the T here for 3 phosphates. That is how life on Earth exists in multicellular animals. This is where energy comes from. This is mitochondrial electron transport with oxidative, meaning oxygen, phosphorylation, adding a phosphate to ATP. That's what it's all about. This is the key to life on Earth right here, what I just showed you. And you don't need to know all the details, but you do need to know you need oxygen to make this happen, and you need all these pumps working, okay? All right, and then there's my theory of dementia. And then, dementia is multifactorial, but the conclusion I came to basically is a neuron has a fixed rate of metabolism that can increase under some circumstances. Like, let's say you're walking through a forest in a jungle or something, and you see, there's a couple of tigers or coyotes in a forest coming towards you. You need to act fast. So the neuron has to go from 0 to 60 real fast. So it has to ramp up its metabolic rate. Well, it needs to ramp up oxygen and glucose production. You have neurovascular coupling, meaning that the blood supply is increased when the neuron becomes more metabolically active. You open up the capillaries in that area, for example. They have to be able to couple, meaning match oxygen glucose delivery and mitochondrial ATP production for the neuron to meet its metabolic demands. If the neuron's metabolic demands get way high and you can't get enough oxygen there, can't get enough glucose there, and the mitochondria in the cell aren't working, it'll try to hang in there a little while, be dysfunctional, and then it'll die. And that's apoptosis. Apoptosis means gradual programmed cell death. That's in comparison with a stroke. A stroke is total occlusion of the artery and everything dies real fast. Apoptosis is, hey, I'm not getting enough energy. I'm not getting enough energy. Come on, guys. 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 Oh, shit. Dies. Okay. That's typical way neurons die. And you don't see that on a brain MRI. You see a stroke. I can point to stroke, say the stroke was right here. With apoptosis, I just see a shrunken brain like the one I showed you earlier. And that's what I see most of the time, just shrunken brains. And this is sort of, I put this whole mnemonic together, all the details of my theory of neurovascular degeneration. I call it the neurovascular uncoupling theory of dementia. It's a Peter Rogers, MD theory. Okay, so anyways, here it is in a more graphical form. I jokingly call oxygen glucose delivery. It's usually abbreviated OGD in the books. I jokingly call it GOD, glucose oxygen delivery. Of course, you know what that word means. Okay, and the MR is metabolic rate. So basically, anything that drops GOD, including mitochondrial inhibitors, SERCA inhibitors, is going to make it harder to provide the metabolic rate to this neuron to maintain it. And then if you have stimulants on there, they're stressed out, they're sleep deprived, they're drinking caffeine, they're eating MSG, MFG, smoking cigarettes, they're taking corticosteroid medicines, they're taking amphetamines, all of these things, glyphosates and excitotoxin as well. Okay, insulin resistance leads to an excitotoxic effect because insulin degrading enzyme is not able to clear the BAP, the beta amyloid protein from the blood. So I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but I think you can see where this is going. Things that people are routinely doing are depriving their brains of the oxygen and glucose they need, and they're routinely ingesting all these mitochondrial toxins. They're destroying their own health without knowing it, If you want to survive, you get out of the firing line. Well, how do you get out of the firing line if you can't see it? Well, you got to learn how to see it. Okay, now we're going to talk about some research on mitochondria. We'll come back to what I just alluded to a moment ago. This is a lady by the name of Maria Mittelbrunn. She is a PhD scientist in Spain, and she's been studying the effect of mitochondria on the immune system, on T cells, and she came to the conclusion that mitochondrial dysfunction is the main reason why people get old, sick, and die. Okay, I thought that was rather interesting. And she noticed that as cells get older, they tend to gradually have more and more mitochondrial problems, and they're less able to function. They're less able to fight off infections, less able to fight off cancer. And they also seem to be just spinning their wheels. When I say spinning their wheels, they tend to just have this chronic, low-grade, unnecessary inflammation that's wasting their resources. And certain things do tend to trend down. If you hear Dr. Caldwell-Esselstyn lecture, he'll talk to you about the natural decrease in nitric oxide production from the endothelial cells, arterial lining cells, as people get older. And that's why he recommends eating plants all day if you're real high cardiac risk, to get the nitrates, precursors for making nitric oxide, systemic nitric oxide, to vasodilate your body, improve your blood flow. But I would say, you know what? People don't deteriorate that fast if they've ate a healthy diet. In the Western world, they deteriorate pretty fast because they've been eating a poor diet, inhibiting their endothelial nitric oxide production. But anyways, Esselstyn is right that most people are getting much more fragile. We all get more fragile as we get older, but it can happen slowly or rapidly. You want it to happen gradually. Well, here's just one paper by Maria Mittelbrunn about how T cells causing with dysfunctional mitochondria induce multiple morbidity, meaning many diseases, and premature senescence, accelerated aging, and death. Okay. Here's another paper by Maria Mittelbrunn. Okay, she says good T cell mitochondrial function is associated with a long, healthy life. So that's the kind of point I'm trying to make. There's actually something, one of the most famous theories of aging is the mitochondrial theory of aging, the oxidative stress theory of aging. All right. So if your mitochondria are working well in your T cells, that means your lymphocytes from your thymus, which is part of your immune system. She says people has a long, healthy life. But if they're not working well, you got mitochondrial dysfunction. She says the patient gets progressively sicker and then dies early. Okay. So rather interesting. This is what I'm getting to. Mitochondria are at the center of it. Now, here is a macrophage. A macrophage is a immune system cell that chases after bacteria and eats them. Macro means big. Phage means to eat. Okay. It's kind of like a giant Pac-Man. Okay. And the bacteria is the little ball that the Pac-Man chases. So what I'm trying to say is if you've ever seen a video, if you can type into your browser, white blood cell chasing a bacteria, something like that, or macrophage eating a bacteria. It takes tons of energy to swim around in the aqueous. Aqueous means water-like media of our human body. It's largely a water-based system, and everything's dissolved in water. And so for that macrophage to chase after bacteria and catch it and eat it, takes tons of energy to do that, tons of it. Okay, how's it going to do that if it's not getting enough oxygen because of atherosclerosis, and then the oxygen delivery is dropped because of the high-fat diet and the high sodium, and then on top of that, the person's ingesting all these mitochondria inhibitors, trashing its mitochondria. It's going to have a hard time catching that bacteria. Okay, a fat old man's not going to catch a teenage bacteria that's running its tail off. Okay, I'm just telling you, it needs tons and tons of energy. So you want your mitochondria to work well, that your bacteria can do its job. This is just a typical example of a video where they'll show you a white blood cell. It's swimming after this bacteria, and the bacteria is trying to get away from it, and the white blood cell's chasing after it. And that's also what I'm going to tell you. The more you study how the human body works, you'll be amazed at how intelligent it is. It's just like the design of it. It's incredible. It's incredible. Watch videos of white blood cells swimming after bacteria, how smart they are. And I know they're following a chemotaxis trail, but it's very impressive and brilliant. So it takes a lot of energy to swim. They need tons of energy. Okay, here's another paper by Maria Mittelbrunn. She says glycolysis is a key player in the inflammatory response. So what she's talking about is during the inflammatory response, much of these quick bursts of speed and motion and activity, you're running on a glycolytic system, meaning they're primarily running anaerobic glycolysis, okay? And these are the T helper cells, TH1 and TH17, for example. By the way I remember T helper cells is the H looks like is also their CD4 cells. Is a 4. If you turn a 4 over, it becomes an H. That's how you can remember it. That will actually be useful if you study the immune system, okay? And that creates the activated inflammatory form of these. Like an M1 macrophage is an aggressive macrophage that participates in the inflammatory response, whereas an M2 macrophage is sort of a turned off macrophage. It's minding its own business at that point. And you need OXPHOS to be able to shut off the immune system. And I'll show you what happens. We talked about a good immune reaction is there's a problem, like let's say a bacteria or tumor, immune system comes in, says, okay, we need to clean up this mess, cleans up the bacteria, says, okay, everything's cool, everything's fine, see you later, bye. That's what you want it to do. But a bad immune response is a chronic one. It won't stop. Chronic inflammation, chronic inflammation, chronic inflammation. You don't want that. So here's a healthy response in a young, healthy person. Immune system initially is running on OXPHOS, oxidative phosphorylation, making ATP with oxygen. It becomes active and has this fast energy phase where it runs on anaerobic glycolysis briefly. And then it says, okay, the problem's under control. Now let's go back to normal. All right. It's a slight difference from its baseline because it's now sort of activated. It's no longer a naive T cell. It's now previously activated. It might become a memory cell, for example, but it's running on oxphos. It's chilled out. It's calmed down. But here's the problem in old people. A lot of times it can't shut off. It can't get its mitochondria to work adequately, and it stays in sort of a chronic inflamed phase. They call this inflammation of aging. Okay, the T cells are not able to get back into oxphos relaxed phase, and they stay in glycolytic mold, and that's real damaging to the person's health. They end up with these chronic inflammatory problems that can progress to neurodegeneration, for example. Okay, and she felt this was the big thing causing rapid aging of people. And here's my point. This is my slide. So what happened with me was I had read about fat causing mitochondrial inhibition of complex 3, and this is the inner mitochondrial membrane. I'm like, yeah, and there's got to be other things doing it too. I go back to my biochem book. I own about 7 biochemistry books. Nothing on mitochondrial inhibition, not even the effect of fat on there, especially saturated fat. So I'm like, this is got to be wrong. So I started going through all these papers on mitochondrial inhibition. So very quickly, I found over 50 mitochondria inhibitors. All right. And so what I'm trying to tell you is there's a lot of situations like this where you got all this literature that's been done, but nobody puts it all together. A lot of these PhDs, they're really smart, but they got tunnel vision. They're just trying to do whatever the grant, somebody gives them grant money. They have to please the grant money company that they're doing something to make that company healthier. They're not looking at the big picture. They haven't read the big picture. So what I'm saying is look how common these things are. These are all mitochondria inhibitors that are potentially going to increase your risk of all these bad diseases. Statins are inhibiting, coenzyme Q. Great. Okay. Maybe that's why there's increased risk of diabetes. Mercury's inhibiting complex 1. My old contact lenses were stored in that. Great. I actually had a little bit of a cataract about 20 years ago. My eye doctor told me. And I said, uh-oh. And I've optimized my health since then. I've never had any progression in 20 years. Okay, I got a little low-grade eye infection, but that's a transient thing. A little blepharitis, conjunctivitis, blepharoconjunctivitis. That's nothing. I'll just put some eye drops in. I'll be better in a couple of days. Okay, what else? All these SSRIs, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors. Those are the antidepressants. Okay, do you understand how bad that is? Somebody's got a problem. They're depressed, low energy. You can't motivate themselves. And you give them a drug that screws up their mitochondria. Doesn't sound too smart to me. Metformin, so-called great diabetes drug. It's an inhibitor of complex 1 in mitochondria. That doesn't sound so intelligent to me because I've had some doctors tell me, oh, I heard that metformin might improve longevity and aging. I'm like, oh, brilliant. They sometimes say, some researchers say, well, it has a transient effect and it activates the mitochondrial stress response and it learns to cope with that. I don't know. I'm not buying that logic. I don't want to mess with my mitochondria. That would all sort of assumes in a laboratory setting, you just got one thing damaging your mitochondria. How about in the real world? You got all this crap coming at your mitochondria, damaging it. You don't want to add to that. Okay. Here's the fungal inhibitors. They put fungal inhibitors, which means things that prevent mold inhibitors in all the processed food. So it can stay on the shelf for a year or 2 years. You walk around, you could hide a bag of one of these processed breads and it'll still be sitting there looking the same a year later. That ain't normal food. Okay. Normal food spoils pretty fast. All right, so what I'm saying is, look at this. Haldol, the anti-schizophrenic medication, will do this. Lead, F- in your tap water. Hydroxynonenal from the omega-6 cooking oils. PFOA, the non-stick cooking pots and pans, are also anti-mitochondrial. BPA, the hard plastic, bisphenol A. Okay, Tylenol, atrazine sprayed on the corn, used to make high fructose corn syrup. This is common stuff. Propofol, a common sedative used in ICU, intensive cares, and during procedures. So anyways, there's a lot of things, okay? And a lot of these antibiotics will do it, aminoglycosides, fluoroquinolones. They put fluoride on tons of medicines because it forms a tight bond replacing a hydrogen and it'll facilitate traversal of the blood-brain barrier. That's how they can, get it, and they can get it into the gonads and the balls for treating an epididymitis or chitis, into the ovaries for treating an infection in that area in a woman, to get it into the brain for treating, a meningitis, encephalitis or something. So it's also on all these neuropsych medicines to get them across these barriers. And it's not even just on that. They put it on, it's common on a lot of antiarrhythmic drugs like flecainide. It's on a ton of things. Like, what is it? Anesthesia. It's on a gastric reflux drug, something like that. It's almost scary how many things it's on. All right. There's other things that affecting the Krebs cycle. So what I'm trying to say is there's tons of things nickel and diming your mitochondria. So you want to try to avoid all these to the extent you can. I call this death by 1,000 cuts. All right. So the last thing I want to do is add to my baseline of this stuff more hypoxia or more mitochondria inhibitors. Okay. Because a lot of people I talk to, they don't ever want to do anything 100%. They're always like, well, I'm cutting down on oil. You know, you're poisoning yourself. You're stupid. Okay. I would just stop doing it. All right. So basically, when we talk about inflammation, here's the old rhyme we learned, first class in pathophysiology. Inflammation means redness, swelling, heat, and pain. So the little mnemonic is inflammatory signs are quite plain. Redness, swelling, heat, and pain. And you can look at the Latin version, rubor, tumor, calor, dolor. This means swelling in Latin. Okay, so getting back to the immune system, here's the lymphatic system. You have drainage vessels for the body. You have an artery that then forms a capillary, and the capillary connects to a vein. The artery is connected to the heart that pumps the whole thing. So there's a pressure system, a pump. The lymphatics is sitting there in the breeze. There's nothing to pump the lymphatics. The lymphatics are like a sewage system, your sewer system, because some stuff will leak out at the capillaries of your arteries and veins. And you need to remove it from that area. Otherwise, it will just pile up and be like a giant garbage dump. Plus, the cells are extruding some waste products, that the lymphatics need to clean up. So you see the problem here? This has a pump. How is this fluid going to flow unless there's something to pump it? And you want to know what the pump is? Flex your muscles. Start walking. Okay, I showed this picture. This is actually a picture of Thomas Jefferson with Ben Franklin and John Adams. And Thomas Jefferson was famous for walking. He'd walk miles and miles every day. And there's lots of, great people who walk miles and miles every day. Beethoven was famous for doing that. Johann von Wolfgang, Goethe, Nietzsche, and a lot of others. It energizes you. It helps you think. Your brain works better when you're walking. You ever have a book, you're looking at it, and you start spacing out. You're tired. You start walking, all of a sudden you can read it. I've done that tons of times. It works because your brain has to be alert when you're walking. Voltaire had said, why do animals have brains but plants do not? Because an animal moves. And once you move, you have to pick a destination, make a value judgment. You have to navigate. You have to avoid obstacles. So it makes you more alert and with it. Okay, the reason why I went through all that was that you got to move your muscles. All you got to do is walk, but you got to do some type of movement activity to pump all these lymphatics. Otherwise, you don't get much lymph flow. I was just reading an interesting book about allergies by some allergist, immunologist, doc. And he's like, unless the person moves, lymphatic flow is very minimal. You increase it like up to 30-fold by exercising. So you got to get that flowing around. The reason you got to get it flowing around is your immune systems have to run all over the body looking for infections and cancer to remove it. And if you don't have good lymph flow, your immune cells, they don't own a car. They need you to move. All right. So basically, how does the immune system work in general? In general, there's like a barrier system, which would be like your skin, for example, the enterocyte lining in the gut. There's a mucosal lining in the lungs and the nose, everywhere. All right. And that blocks out bacteria, for example. If some of them sneak through for whatever the reason, you got these macrophage, big eaters that will eat the thing. Once they've eaten the bacteria, they will chop it up into bits, and then they'll put some of the little bits on their outer surface. Those are called antigens, meaning capable of stimulating an immune response. They then will travel to a lymphocyte, activate a lymphocyte, and you can activate the cytotoxic T cells, the CD8s, and they can kill the bacteria themselves. You can activate B cells. Here's the B cells. So there's two main types of lymphocytes. There's T cells from the thymus by your neck, and those are your T lymphocytes, your T helper cells, your T killer cells of the CD8 type. Okay, but it's also then you have something comes from your bone marrow, and those are called B cells. And the B cells are the ones that make antibodies. And then those antibodies travel all over the body trying to find this bacteria and to remove it. Okay, that's basically how the immune system works. And like I said, the immune system is incredibly complex and fascinating. And there's a lot of things in the human eye. They're just way beyond what we could fully understand. We understand them as best we can, but there's way more to them. These are just a couple topics that are just off the charts in complexity. So, and the other thing too is how do all these cells talk to each other? And it's like reading Braille. They can feel the outer surface of each other and make a decision. This is self, meaning normal, belongs here, or this is non-self. Non-self does not belong in the human body. So if it's non-self, they will attack it. If it is bacteria, they can get a general sense of the categories. This right here is called the innate immune system, means everybody has this from the day they're born. This is called the adaptive immune system, meaning that these cells have to be specifically activated. They're very precise and fussy about what they will react with. So these guys will fight any bacteria that comes into the body, your macrophages, your dendritic cells, for example, your neutrophils. Whereas a lymphocyte will only fight against the bacteria where it has a match for it. It has receptors on its surface called PRRs, pattern recognition receptors. It will only fight specifically something that matches its receptor. So most lymphocytes sitting around doing nothing. It's only the ones with a perfect match that will be activated. And remember this point about the braille. You have to have cells moving around fast so they can bounce into each other and read each other's braille. Okay. So like what happens? Let's say here you got a cancer in the lung. An immune cell will be activated, a macrophage. It'll carry that activation like cancer cell or bacteria, and it'll send it to the lymph node, and it'll bounce around. It keeps bouncing around with all the cells. You got a match, you got a match, you got a match, you got a match, you got a match. Can you help me? And most of these lymphocytes will say, no, it's not my job. No, it's not me. Don't bug me. No, it's not me. And it'll have to go through a whole bunch of them before it finds a match. It could go through millions of them before it finds a match for a cell that's going to help it. That's partly why the adaptive immune response takes time to ramp up. It can take days longer. All right. And then the lymphocyte, once they find a match that's activated, that lymphocyte will jump into the blood and it'll go looking for the tumor cell or for the infection. So I joke that it's like jumping out of a plane. Go, time to go out there and fight the infection. So I joke it's like a paratrooper. And it reminds me of the old song, we used to sing when we were kids. Up in the morning with the rising sun, I pack my gear and I load my gun. C-130 rolling down the strip. Looks like we're going to take a little trip. Mission top secret, destination unknown. I may not be coming home. Stand up, hook up, shuffle to the door. Jump out and shout, Marine Corps. So that's what it's like. Okay, they got to go, 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 go. So how does the immune system recognize an infection? They've got these PRRs, pattern recognition receptors, for PAMPs, MAMPs, and DAMPs, and CAMPs. Okay, so what is that all about? A PAMP means a pathogen. Pathogen means disease-causing molecular pattern. Okay, a MAMP is microbial-associated molecular pattern, like a bacteria. Okay, a DAMP means damaged tissue, damage-associated molecular pattern, and a CAMP is cancer-associated molecular pattern. So the cell will have receptors on it. The typical macrophage, big eater, sitting beneath a barrier is going to be what's called a dendritic cell. And they'll have receptors for the stuff. Like a typical bacteria, gram-positive bacteria, which is a major category of bacteria, will have LTA, lipoteichoic acid. Gram-negatives will have LPS, lipopolysaccharide. Okay, these are the classic bacterial endotoxins. This is sort of the prototype LPS. You'll hear about that all the time if you study this. Okay, and if there's damaged tissue, it's the immune system's job to clean it up. If there's a cancer, it's the immune system's job to remove it from the body. Once they've interacted with one of these molecules that activates them, they will, for example, ingest the bacteria, and then they chop it into pieces, and they'll start to show the pieces on their cell surface, travel to the lymph node, try to find a match, and then once they found a match, the matched lymphocytes will undergo colonal proliferation, and then they'll jump into the blood and go chase after the infection or whatever the problem was, the cancer. Okay, so like I was showing, this is the basic way the immune system works. This is the innate component, the initial component that interacts with the insult to health. These cells are connected to each other by TJs, tight junctions, okay? So here's their apical side, their luminal side that interacts with the lumen of the vessel or the outside world, and then their inner side is their basal side. Sometimes this part would be called lateral, so basolateral side. And this is a barrier to infections or to other things, to cancer. Once something gets across this barrier, the immune system will have to respond to it right away, okay? Deeper, you'll have a basement membrane that holds things in place. You'll have connective tissue. ECM is extracellular matrix. Then you'll have the cells of the given organ, whatever it might be, deep to that. Okay, so here's basically, the hero of the story is a dendritic cell. It's a macrophage, meaning a big eater, but it's just like a subtype of macrophages. It's got these little tentacles around its outer surface, kind of looking like a starfish, because the tentacles allow it to surveil more surface area to find a match. And it's looking for like, a PAMPs, a pathogen-associated molecular pattern. So it sort of sits there underneath the epithelial barrier. It's like a guard. They're also called sentinel cells, going back and forth, looking for trouble. Is there a problem here? Is there a problem here? Okay. And if you get a break in the tight junctions, bacteria might come, rushing in, and it'll eat them like a Pac-Man. Once it eats them, it'll display, see the little purple dots on the periphery, it'll display them in its periphery, go to the lymph node and start looking for a match. And most of the lymphocytes in the lymph node, they won't be a match. So they'll just say, not my job, not my job. But that's the big thing. And I call this ride where the macrophage runs through the lymphatic vessels until it reaches a node. It has to travel some distance. I call that like the ride of Paul Revere. Okay. So, here's Paul Revere's ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Okay. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for our country folk to be up and on to arm. Okay, so I had to memorize that in school. Okay, it's a good poem. Okay, Longfellow. There was a playground named after Longfellow when I was a kid. All these places were named after the great poets. Okay, so anyways, the reason I show you that is this dendritic cell has to book over here, and it has to activate the lymph node saying, wake up, guys, help me out, help me out. I'm overwhelmed. There's tons of bacteria. There's a crap load of them, and they're subepithelial. We're in trouble. Help me out. And it'll have to bounce around maybe through a million of them, or finds one that'll finally help them. Because most of them, like I said, say, not my job. And it kind of reminds me of the children's story. Are you my mother? If you remember this story, the children's story, another one I read when I was young, the poor little bird was, his mom was away for a while and starts running around asking every other animal, are you my mother? Are you my mother? So that's what the dendritic cell is doing. It's saying, please help me, please help me. And almost all the lymphocytes say, take a hike, get out of here, till it finds one that'll help them. Okay, so based on the reason I went through all that stuff of how the immune system works is once you know that, now you can make sense of why certain things will help. Okay, first of all, you want to avoid excessive fat and excessive dietary sodium because they're going to drop oxygen delivery to tissues, and they're also going to injure the endothelium. I'll come to that in a moment. And so they're going to screw up your immune system, and they're going to increase your cancer risk. You want to avoid acidity just in general because that facilitates cancer growth. All right. You want to get sunshine because that increases vitamin D, which improves immune function. You want to stay warm. Okay. Because when you're warm, you get more movement. Why do you think you get a fever when you have an infection? Because it speeds up the immune function so it can do its job more effectively. So I like being warm. A lot of my family, they always want the temperature like 5 or 10 degrees colder than me. And I tell them it's because they're a bunch of fat meat eaters. They got more subcutaneous fat. And then they say to me, it's because you're hypothyroid. So I checked my thyroid. My thyroid function is totally normal. And I got more energy than them. I tell them they're like fat dinosaur retards. Anyways, eat a low-fat diet. You get all the good stuff, potassium, magnesium. You get the vasodilators, increase your blood supply, oxygen delivery to those tissues. Antioxidants, come in there. When you want those, your fiber also will protect your epithelial barriers. It prevents leaky gut, prevents leaky blood-brain barrier. That keeps you smart, having a good blood-brain barrier. Nitrates are the precursors to making systemic nitric oxide. That's the whole thing, like with Esselstyn eating the plants and the whole pathway of that. Exercise, get your body moving so your white blood cells are moving around because you're pumping your lymphatics when you do that. Okay, and if you don't have most of us don't have time to go to health club. Just whenever you have a break, start walking and moving. You get a phone call, you're at work, stand up while you're talking on the phone. Take little breaks between whatever episodes of work you do. Walk around the room, park your car far, take the stairs instead of the elevator. There's a bunch of things you could do. Okay, let's see, avoid mitochondrial inhibitors. And I just showed you the slide with about 50 of them. Avoid those things because if you drop your mitochondrial function, you're in a sense making yourself older. Okay. Also, the high-fat diets, the high animal protein, they activate mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. That's mechanistic target of rapamycin. That's the nutrient-sensing pathway that basically, when it gets everything it needs, like a contractor getting ready to build a building, it says, go ahead, tells the cell to replicate. You don't want accelerating cell replication because that accelerates the rate at which you reach the Hayflick limit. You only get about 60 divisions for regular cells. So you don't want to speed that up. Okay, what else? Avoid the SERCA inhibitors. We talked about that. The endoplasmic reticulum calcium storage inhibitors, which is a lot of toxic smells, volatile organic compounds. Anything that elevates hemoglobin A1C causes insulin resistance will also lead to decreased SERCA function. That's how you can estimate your SERCA inhibition. That's a useful way to partially estimate it. Avoid excessive stress because stress shuts off your immune system. Avoid stress equivalents, sleep deprivation, go to bed earlier, caffeine. Okay, avoid those things. You don't need caffeine. I'll show you a trick for avoiding caffeine in just a moment. Have a sense of purpose in your life because when you have a strong sense of purpose, it makes you more resilient to resist and be able to stand up to all the problems in life, the setbacks. You have what's called an autonomic nervous system. And again, it's a little bit of a seesaw. There's sympathetic autonomic nervous system, which is your stress response, your fight or flight. And that shuts off the immune system because you're not worried about, fixing an infection. You're just worried about surviving the next 20 minutes. Parasympathetic autonomic nervous system is more of your gradual one. It's called the feed and breed. So sympathetic is fight or flight, being chased by a tiger in the dark. Parasympathetic, the opposite, is feed and breed, rest and digest. You want to spend more of your life in pans if you can. Okay, things like religion helps. Religious people, all the major religions, their populations are much healthier than non-religious people. Positive conversation, that also kind of puts you into a positive mood. It tells your body to relax. Enjoying positive music with a melody. You know, a good sign of friends is that you're able to laugh together. Social support, all those things are helpful because they're going to push you into PANS, parasympathetic, feed and breed, rest and digest. Here's your intestinal lining. And you've got a single layer of cells. They're called enterocytes because it's the gut's called the enteric tract. So these are enterocytes. You could also call them intestinal epithelial cells. Epithelium just means the lining cells of a tube. TJs are the tight junctions. You can see the dendritic cells. This is what I meant. They got little tentacles that go all over the place trying to feel for problems. All right. So anyways, when you eat dietary fiber, the dietary fiber is converted by the good bacteria in your gut. By the way, you only need to know 2 bacteria. People are going to try to tell you all this complex stuff, all this probiotic stuff. Look, eat your fiber, and the good gut bacteria will proliferate with that. They make short-chain fatty acids, in particular butyrate, 4-carbon butyrate. Enterocytes take that and they use that to make tight junctions. That's what you need to know. You need to know that. Bacteria feeds the good, fiber feeds the good bacteria. Fiber is only from plants, no fiber in meat. And they use that to make butyrate, taken up by the gut lining cells, and they use that to make tight junctions, and that prevents leaky gut. That's what you need to know. Then the question is, well, if you don't get enough fiber, you'll have a tendency to get leaky gut. And all these other things cause leaky gut. And leaky gut's the most common cause of autoimmune disease. So if you got an autoimmune disease, first thing I would do if I had an autoimmune disease would be go through this list and make sure I'm avoiding all these things and make sure I'm eating enough fiber. Okay. Dennis Burkitt felt it was probably normal for us to eat more like 100 grams a day. And, at a minimum, we should be getting 50. The average American's only getting about 10. Because if you lose these tight junctions, you'll get bacterial endotoxins, LPS, coming through. And it's a very toxic stuff. It also makes the blood more prone to clotting. And the bacteria themselves will often get through, create all kinds of problems, not to mention the autoimmune disease type stuff. Excuse me. Okay, and the endotoxins, like I said, that will come in. They interact with fibrinogen, a blood protein, and they change it from being shaped like a cylinder, like a slinky, and they make it flat, so it becomes like a beta-pleated sheet. And once it's flat, it can stack up like a deck of cards and bind to other fibrinogens, fibrins. And then the bigger a molecule gets bound to itself, the more likely it will precipitate out of solution, form a clot. And they form these clots that are very difficult to lyse, refractory to lysis. They're called dense matter deposits. The people who've done the most work on this are like Douglas Kell, the English PhD guy, and Theresia Pretorius, the South Africa lady. They're both really smart. Again, they deserve a Nobel Prize. They'll never get nothing, though, because it correlates to nutrition and health. Okay, when you eat a high-fat meal, that will elevate after. Prandial means to eat, so postprandial endotoxemia. Endotoxemia means LPS elevated in the blood, okay? So that's what I'm saying is you predispose yourself to clotting. People usually die from clotting. Only in the movies do people die from bleeding, okay? In real life, the vast majority of people die from a clot. A clot in the heart is a heart attack, myocardial infarction. Clot in the brain is a stroke, okay? You clot up the arteries of Johnson, it don't work no more, okay? Lots of people have all these problems due to clotting. You clot the blood supply to the eye, you go blind. You clot the blood supply to the ear, you go deaf. Okay, here is showing a wall. It's a painting by the great artist Don Troiani. And when the wall has been breached, this is like breaching the wall of your gut, your epithelial barrier. You got problems, okay? And so I reminded of this scene from A Few Good Men with Jack Nicholson was Colonel Jessup in charge of guarding that wall. And Tom Cruise was sort of the young hotshot, big mouth young lawyer. And so he's got Jack Nicholson on the stand, and Tom Cruise was questioning him. Colonel Jessup says, "You want answers?" Cruise says, "I think I'm entitled to them." Jessup, "You want answers?" Cruise, "I want the truth." Jessup, "You can't handle the truth." "Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's going to do it? You? I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know. And my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, it saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. from A Few Good Men movie. Okay, so anyways, here's Dennis-Burkitt's abdominal pressure syndrome. Basically, these are all the diseases are caused when a person doesn't eat dietary fiber. It's a lot of them and they're bad, so eat your fiber. Okay, let's see what else. Oh, here's a good quote from Jeff Nelson. Fiber is life, pharma is death. And that is very true. Talked about LPS predisposing to forming clots. And you could just feed a mouse high-fat diet, and they quickly show a decrease in intellectual function. You get brain fog. If you don't got enough fiber, you don't maintain either your gut barrier and you don't maintain your blood-brain barrier. So you need to have a precise perineuronal milieu in your brain so you can maintain all your electronic ion gradients precisely. That makes you smart. If you have a leaky blood-brain barrier because of lack of dietary fiber, lack of butyrate, you get the wrong elements in your perineuronal milieu, microenvironment, and the neurons don't work as fast, don't work as effectively. You get brain fog, makes you stupid. There's one after another study, you'll see that. High-fat diets, Western diets, mice become stupid, okay? And the humans do too. People nowadays think it's normal to be stupid. If you look back at history, let's say in the 1800s, people routinely would read triple-decker novels like the Charles Dickens novels, Victor Hugo novels, Fyodor Dostoevsky novels, 500, 1,000 pages. They were quite happy to read these bestsellers, okay? Nowadays, you can barely get somebody to read, a tweet, okay? I'm just saying, how many people read 500 to 1,000-page novels, okay? We're all busy, and nowadays there's other entertainment. You could watch TV, you could watch the internet. Yeah, sure. A good place to read one of those big novels if you want to is have audiobooks in the car. You got nothing else to do when you're commuting to work or something. Okay, here's just a little bit about how blood vessels work. Here's a normal capillary. Typically, the red blood cells are about 7 microns. The capillaries are about 5 microns. And so the red blood cell has to deform itself, has to fold back on itself when it goes through the capillary. The yellow is the capillary basement membrane. The green is the vascular smooth muscle cells. The blue circles here are the oxygen, so they pass from the red blood cell to the tissue. In this case, we're talking about the brain, so this will be a neuron, and it'll need lots of oxygen. Okay, that's how it's supposed to be. So the red cells are traveling from this side to this side. Okay, these are the endothelial cells, spindle-shaped inside the vessel. Okay, well, here's the point. When you get diabetes, you get thickening of the capillary basement membrane. So this yellow membrane thing, it's thick, harder for the oxygen to get through there. You get hypertrophy of the vascular smooth muscle. You also get collagen fibrosis laid down along the wall, protecting it from the hypertension and from the diabetes-related problems. So anyways, less oxygen gets to the tissue. You get worsening hypoxia. Hypoxia means lowered oxygen to the tissue. So we talked about how and this happens everywhere in the body, when you lower oxygen delivery enough due to this combination of structural damage from hypertension and diabetes, as well as, meal toxins in a sense, excessive fat, excessive sodium, you are dropping oxygen delivery to your tissues. So your tissues aren't going to function as well. Eventually, they're prone to dying due to, if it gets severe enough, going to apoptosis, and your immune system's not going to work so well. Well, there's another part of the immune system called complement. And complement is a bunch of proteins that when they see a problem, they find a bacteria, they all get together and they blow a hole in it. Okay. And that's called forming a membrane attack complex. And it's like a Bangalore torpedo. And it really reminded me of the scene from Saving Private Ryan when they're on the beach, Omaha Beach. And so they try to get up close to one of the barriers that had been put in front of them. And they assemble this device, which is like assembling the complement proteins to put a hole into the barrier that was keeping them out from progressing on the beach in France. So anyways, that's how that works. That's the complement system. We're not going to go into complement system, but I'm just letting you know that's another component primarily of the innate system, but it can connect the innate to the adaptive system. We won't get into all that, but it's kind of an interesting thing. Here's a summary of some of the more detailed things of the immune system. We're not going to go into all this, but just so you're aware of it, if you want to look it up, where I explain some of the little tricky little things about how the immune system works. You've got your own defense systems, like I talked about, your immune system fighting bacteria and cancers, your liver system, detoxifying chemicals. It's like the immune system for chemicals. The seesaw effect I talk about, your autonomic system and your stress response, getting you ready to fight a predatory animal if it was coming after you. Your antioxidants to fight oxidative stress. The diet to prevent all these problems of hypertension that leads to atherosclerosis and diabetes. Okay, then I kind of joke and say reading, writing, and then the religion getting you to prevent bad behavior. All right, so just a real quick point about the brain. There's a vertical alignment of the brain, the vertical anatomy of the brain. At the bottom is the reptile brain. The brain stem and the basal ganglia are part of that. The next level up is the mammal brain, shaped like a letter C, and that's really the emotional brain. The reptile brain is the instinct brain, and then the human brain where your thought is, that comes from your cerebral cortex up above. You can put this in an evolutionary context, but that's just how the brain works. And the relevance of that, why is it useful to know that? When you see yourself slipping into sort of a mammal, limbic brain, emotional brain, and let's say you're with your significant other, you're with your girlfriend, your wife or something, don't say something that's going to piss her off, insult her, hurt her feelings, keep her mad at you for a long time. Just say, we'll talk about it tomorrow or something like that. So it's metacognition. Realizing that you're moving into sort of an emotional, impulsive mood or attitude helps you to control your speech so you say the right thing. Cerebral cortex is sort of the things that get you to do what you know you should do even when you don't feel like it, to delay gratification, to do the right thing even when it's not easy to do the right thing. Okay, we have a default mode network here in the middle, and actually it's right here in the cingulate gyrus, and that's sort of how the brain travels through the past and the future. Like I say, oh, my girlfriend, she wanted to go to a movie last night. I couldn't because I had to work or study, but I'll take her this weekend, so I'll make it up to her. Everything will be fine. So that's how the brain time travels through the cingulate system, default mode network. That's what we do most of the time when we're not busy with something else. Task-based network is to be called into the present and busy with a task where we only think about that. And that's why if a person is sad or depressed or something, a lot of times getting busy with a task will get them to forget about it. I went through more how the brain works in my other lecture about how to prevent dementia. Okay, and why did I go through all that stuff? Because I'm leading up to this picture here. This is a man in an acute stress response. They call it a rage reaction, but it's really the acute stress response. So what's going on is the center of your brain is what is called the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And what you want to be is, as much of the time as you can, is everything is cool, you're at rest, you're relaxed, you're just peacefully enjoying your day, doing whatever you have to do, having a meal, talking with friends and family or whatever. That's how you want to spend most of your life. And that's parasympathetic largely, meaning your relaxed form, feed and breathe, rest and digest. But when you're pissed off or stressed out or in danger, you go into the fight or flight mode. So there's constant communication between your brain and your hypothalamus. Is everything cool? Yes, everything's cool. Is everything cool? Yes, everything's cool. Is everything cool? Yes, everything's cool. No, there's a problem. Okay, here comes saber-tooth tiger or whatever else it will be. And that will activate this and release all the hormones, including the stress response, and shut off your immune system. Okay, so you don't want to unnecessarily be going into your stress response. Cortisol, besides shutting off your immune system, has a whole bunch of harmful effects, and it also makes you fat, and it also increases your risk of diabetes. And doesn't that fit for a lot of Americans? Sleep deprived, drinking caffeine, and stressed out. Okay, so this is it. Also, here it is. It shuts off your immune system. Okay, and this is just another paper to the same effect. You can find tons of them. And this is that sort of limbic circuit. The medial edge of the brain is called the limbic system. It means like an edge. And basically, you have your amygdala, which is your stress and fear center. And when that's worried, you're going to overactivate your hypothalamus to stay in stress mode. Here's your hippocampus, your memory center. And basically, there's a competition of all your brain to who gets to control the hypothalamus. And you want yourself in everything is cool, feed and breathe, rest and digest, parasympathetic, as much as you can. And here's just an example of social support. This painting is called Filial Piety, Family Piety, the Paralytic. So basically, this poor old guy is paraplegic. You know, he'd be dead if the family wasn't taking care of him. Social support really makes a big difference for us. Plus, also, people often have highs and lows in their life. And when they're during a low, they'll especially need more social support. Okay, there's something called the Rosetto effect. And was a town in Pennsylvania, Rosetto, where you had all these Italian multi-generational families, you know, the grandchildren with the parents and the grandparents all in the same house, living next door to their cousin, and they would all help each other. So they were dramatically much, much more healthy than other demographically matched populations that didn't have their extended families living nearby. So a smart thing to do is, if you can, live next to some of your friends and family so you can help each other when necessary. And so what I'm basically saying is, imagine Luigi. He's by himself in the city. He loses his job. He's screwed. He can't pay his rent. He can't buy food. What's he going to do? On the other hand, if Luigi's living in Rosetto, he loses his job, the family will support him until he gets a new job, okay? They'll pay him back. Whoop-de-doo. I knew lots of real nice Italian families when I was growing up. They're super nice and warm. Here's a couple quotes about, handling stress. This is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, some type of psychiatrist or something. I forget exactly. They wrote a good book, The Body Keeps the Score. I remember liking this when I read it. I read it many years ago, but I just had the quote handy. So people need to be able to feel safe. They need to, that's probably the most important thing for them, to have good mental health so their physiology can calm down. They can go into parasympathetic, okay? Feed and breathe, rest and digest. They need that visceral feeling of safety. And the most important thing for a person to handle a psychologically traumatic event is good social support. And that's a lot of like what a mother's especially good for, unconditional love. And the father should be that way the same too when one of their children or a friend is going through a real difficult time. People need that social support where they can just be themselves. They're not going to be hassled or forced into some conformist, unnatural behavior. So that's a lot of what it's about, to calm a person down and let them be happy. And, you know, Carl Jung would talk about this too in psychology. You have to, and Carl Rogers, you have to just let the person be themselves, because a lot of people won't let you be yourself. They've got all these rules you have to obey. They're a pain in the butt. Okay. So I'm just saying, to calm somebody down, you need that. And people need that to lower their stress response so their immune system works and they can sleep. Okay. Nav Chandel, he's a famous mitochondrial researcher, and he pointed out metabolism is driving things, not the genes. And that's an important point, because all the conventional medical textbooks, they're going to talk about genes, genetics to you're so sick of it, you can't even believe it. And it's mostly a bunch of BS. Metabolism is really driving things. So if they want to get useful results, they have to study metabolism. Okay. And like I said, Luke O'Neill's come to that conclusion, Maria Middlebrun, Lydia Lynch, and other researchers. Okay. And I can tell you, I've had some doctors talk to me and they're like, Pete, all this stuff you're talking about, this mitochondria stuff, cytoplasm calcium, the plasma membrane ion pumps, it's like you put together all this pathophysiology. And they said, that's what we should be focusing on. They said, instead, we're giving drugs that inhibit the mitochondria, increase cytoplasm calcium, drug-based medicine for chronic disease. It's stupid. Yes, it is. Okay, this is just an old thing. I've shown you this graph before. Basically, you know, the American high-fat diet, all these problems. East Asian diet, they're much better in terms of low fat with eating a lot of white rice, but they screw up because they eat way too much sodium, typically like the Japanese in the 1960s. And nowadays they're screwing up. They're eating more fried food. The Indian diet, I used to think everybody from India was real healthy, but it turns out a lot of them have health problems. And I think the main reason from studying their diet is they have, no, it's not the ghee is a problem, you know, the butter, but it's the main thing is that they eat too much fried food. Many of them do. Okay. Low fat, low sodium, whole food, vegan diet. You got a low risk of all the common chronic diseases. Okay, so these are things that will decrease your health, like we talked about with our Super Mario Brothers video game. So you want to avoid all this stuff. And here's all the things that will improve immune function and keep you healthy. You want to do all this stuff. Be warm, get your exercise, get your sunshine, have positive relationships, you know, be kind and loving, enjoy laughter with your friends, all this stuff. Have a religion, have a strong sense of purpose in your life that makes you more resilient. Avoid toxins. You got to learn about them so you can avoid them. Mitochondrial toxins, circuit inhibitors, excitotoxins, which is really a word for stimulants, but it includes MFG and all that stuff. Filter your water, because there's a lot of toxic stuff in your water if you don't. And then, oh, here's the caffeine substitute I meant to tell you about. Like if I find myself, you know, behind the eight ball, having tons and tons of work to do, being kind of tired, not as well slept the night before I was on call or something, I'll guzzle down 32 ounces of beet juice. It doesn't have to be this brand, any brand of beet juice. And I'll guzzle down, you know, 12 ounces of water, any brand of water, any brand of bottled water, if I think it's a good one. I don't want F- in there and stuff like that. But what I'm trying to say is that energizes me. Maybe because it's the hydration. Maybe it's because of the increase in blood glucose for a little while. Maybe it's because of nitrate precursors in beet juice. They put bicycle riders on a stationary bike on time trials, and they perform better at that. All I know is my performance increases for the next 6 hours. And then the reason I do it, why do I do it? Because I don't get any caffeine. So I sleep really well at night. I don't drink any caffeine at all. None. I used to, for about 20 years, I used to have some coffee, but I quit doing that many years ago, and I'm glad. I'm so glad I did that. It took about a couple of weeks before I came back to my normal self. Why does Beethoven have so much energy? Because he's got a beat in his name. Okay. Here's biophilia. Nature makes us happy, you know, just to be around, you know, beautiful nature. You know, if you get a billionaire, what are they going to do? They're going to buy a house on a hill next to a lake. Okay. It just is, you know, given the chance that we have, it just makes us happy to see that. Maybe because the water is, you know, sustenance and food potentially. This is, I think, one of the greatest landscape paintings of all time. It's Among the Sierra Nevada Mountains by Albert Bierstadt. Sierra means like saw in Spanish, so it's like a whole bunch of mountains and a mountain range. It looks like a saw. Okay, so anyways, looking at art, these are all things that make us happy. And, you know, Helen Keller, happiness comes from loyalty to a worthy purpose. I like the Arthur Schopenhauer quote, the best source of happiness comes from who the man is. A happy life is impossible. The highest a man can achieve is a heroic life. So basically, a lot of us, we're sort of like half screwed. You know, we got problems in our life that are unfixable. We just have to do the best we can. But we sort of say to yourself, well, I'm also half blessed, and I will be grateful for that, an attitude of gratitude. And I'll just do the best I can with the time I have left. And when you see yourself doing the best you can with the time you have left on this planet, It makes you happy because you like yourself, because you know you're doing the best you can do. So that's how you make yourself happy, is think about your life, say, what's the best I can do at the time I got left, and do it. And that will make you happy. Versus if you go around chasing cheap pleasures, you often will not be happy. Drinking, chasing relationships that you shouldn't chase, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So stick with the good stuff and make your life kind of like this good source of energy in the world, and you'll be happier. Okay, a little bit more about blood flow. Can I keep going? I got not a whole lot more here.
Sure. No, let's go.
Okay, so when you eat a high-fat meal, normally your blood is translucent. You can see through it, the plasma. If you're eating a high-fat meal, you'll start to make the plasma radio opaque. It'll become opaque. You can't see through it. If you sediment out blood, the red blood cells sediment to the bottom, and that's about 44%. That's your hematocrit. White blood cells go to the middle. It's called the Buffy coat, and the platelets as well. And then the plasma, which just contains proteins, things like your antibodies, immune globulins, and your fibrinogen, your clotting protein. That's where they sit in your albumin, like a carrier protein. Okay, so anyways, high fat visibly makes your blood thickened. To look at it, like we were saying, red blood cells are about 7 microns, capillaries about 5 microns, and then they have to pass through here. They have to fold back on themselves to get through, so they need to be flexible. When you eat a lot of fat, it's a bridging molecule. The LDL cholesterol and the chylomicrons, it sticks the red blood cells together. Now you're like pushing a submarine sandwich through the vessel, so pressure has to go up because you're pumping like a milkshake instead of pumping water. And there's a couple of these molecules. They're called bridging molecules. LDL cholesterol, we mentioned. Fibrinogen, the clotting protein, we mentioned, that goes up in stress. So stress makes you more prone to clotting. Uric acid gets elevated in the blood, for example, by eating high fructose corn syrup. IgM antibodies, like in the acute phase of an infection, those are the first ones pushed out into the blood. The bridging molecule overcomes the negative charge of the red blood cells. Red blood cells have a negative charge on their outer surface. That's called a zeta potential. And it's so that they don't stick together. You don't want them to randomly clot. However, if you have these bridging molecules in your blood, they'll stick the red blood cells together, and you don't want that. That's one of the reasons why, that's the main reason why LDL cholesterol, elevated blood cholesterol, is a risk factor for having a heart attack, because it makes the blood clot. It increases the tendency of the blood to clot. And by the way, atherosclerosis is a blood clot. You need to know that. Atherosclerosis is a blood clot. If you understand that, you'll be able to read the literature and make sense out of it. If you don't know that, you won't be able to read it. Here is LDL cholesterol. The higher the LDL cholesterol in the blood, the higher the viscosity. There's all kinds of nonsense on the internet. I think like a lot of these internet channels, they're designed to confuse people. I see all kinds of videos saying, oh, well, cholesterol, is it really associated with atherosclerosis? Yes, it is. That has been shown a long time ago. It's proven. There's mountains of data to support that. So it's like the most important risk factor because it's so common. Average American's got a total cholesterol in the ballpark of like 220. Okay. You go to some of these provinces in China, like when T. Colin Campbell wrote the book China Study, they would have total cholesterol like 90 to 100, 110 or something. Mine usually bounces from 90 to 120. I'm a low fat, 100% vegan. Okay, so we talked about them sticking the red blood cells together. Normal blood flow is like a it's called laminar flow, and it's like a parabolic velocity profile. Red blood cells are in the center, so it's like your hand. Red blood cells are in the center. White blood cells are just outside of them, and then your thumbs are like the plasma. So the plasma runs right next to the arterial wall. The arterial wall is called the endothelium, the lining cells. Okay, this is work done by Roy Swank. Dr. McDougall has a video of this on his channel about blood sludge. And the point of it is when you eat a high-fat meal, you're overcoming the zeta potential. The chylomicrons and the LDL cholesterol are sticking the red blood cells together. So you get all these clumps of cells. And you'll see flow visibly slowing down as it travels through these vessels. And that's also why if you go eat food, you split at like a greasy spoon type of place, you feel a little sluggish afterwards. And this can persist for quite a while. All right. This is a picture of what happens when blood flow comes up. This will be the common carotid artery in the neck. And then this is how I would draw it. Or I can use this hand. Let's see, this is where. So my thumb is the internal carotid artery, goes to the brain. My fingers here are the external carotid, goes up to the face. And so what I'm trying to show you is when the blood comes up the common carotid artery, it hits the median divider and it bounces off that. When it bounces off that, it produces a bunch of turbulent flow. And it'll also produce some retrograde currents, retrograde eddy currents. And when you have an excessive amount of turbulent flow or an excessive amount of eddy currents, that confuses the lining cells of the artery. And they start to shed their glycocalyx, their sugar coating. They're normally antithrombotic coating. And once they do that, clots will form because now adhesive prothrombotic molecules will be exposed on that arterial lining, and they will cause adhesion of red blood cells and white blood cells, and that's prothrombotic, and you'll start to form an atherosclerotic plaque. So an atherosclerotic plaque is a blood clot on the side of a vessel wall. And there'll be an ongoing steady state, contest to see, can this be reabsorbed or will it get bigger? Can this be reabsorbed or will it get bigger? And I'll see carotid artery clots, atherosclerotic plaques that sit unchanged, seemingly unchanged on CT angiograms for 10, 15 years. Okay, but as the patient gets older, eventually it's prone to getting bigger and getting worse. Sometimes it can rapidly get bigger. Best thing to do is just prevent them by eating a healthy diet. Okay, and so the reason I showed you that is I made the point that you're sort of denuding the endothelium here. You're removing the glycocalyx, and that's exposing the prothrombotic molecules. And those prothrombotic molecules will cause a clot, meaning an atherosclerotic plaque, and little pieces could break off and cause a stroke. It could progressively occlude the whole artery. But guess what? It can cause other problems too. And that's kind of one of the points I was building up. I know I gave you a lot of background information. You can watch this video twice or 3 times. You can hit the print screen button and save a picture if you think it'll be useful to you. And so here's what I'm trying to show you. When you track, the green lines are the endothelial glycocalyx. It's a bunch of glycoproteins that are antithrombotic. They sort of make it slippery when wet. They prevent stuff from sticking to the endothelial cells. Endothelial cells are the lining cells of the artery. So what I'm saying is excessive turbulent flow from severe hypertension causes this abnormal flow here, chaotic flow, excessive turbulent flow, retrograde eddy currents, and the glycocalyx will be shed because the endothelial cell senses that as arterial injury, and so it thinks it has to form a clot to prevent bleeding. Our ancestors worried about bleeding, getting chased by a saber-toothed tiger, okay? So anyways, when you now expose these prothrombotic molecules, you can form, like I said, the normal blood, the red blood cells can stick to them, forming a clot. But guess what? Metastasizing cancer cells are traveling around in the blood, and they're looking for something to grab onto. You're now giving them a good target to attach to. And so what I'm trying to say is hypertension isn't just the main risk factor for atherosclerosis. It's also a risk factor for cancer. You see how the metastatic cancer cell now has exposure. It has a clean shot at the endothelial adhesive molecules. So that's an important point. Here's the shed pieces of glycocalyx. They're floating off in the blood. They'll have to be reabsorbed elsewhere. All right. So here's what normally happens. You got this antithrombotic glycocalyx, and that's protecting. Here's one paper, if you want to read about it, a paper down here, a reference, if you're curious. And so normally the endothelial cells are making nitric oxide. It's a gas. It goes into the lumen of the artery, interacts with the blood. It inhibits the platelets. It prevents the platelets from clotting. Other things on that endothelial surface, something called heparin sulfate, antithrombin 3, they're also preventing clotting. Okay, the nitric oxide gas, in addition to diffusing into the lumen of the artery, it diffuses back into the wall of the artery, and it causes the vascular smooth muscle cells to relax. So the artery opens up, it vasodilates, okay? The medicine Viagra opens up, increases nitric oxide in the Johnson, okay, to improve blood flow to that area. So what I'm trying to say is nitric oxide does the same thing all over the body to increase blood flow. But here's some of the problems you run into. If you eat excessive dietary sodium, or if you're excessively stressed, you will cause activation of the platelets, and you will cause a decrease in the amount of nitric oxide available. So now you're going to have a lot of active platelets, meaning they're more sticky, and they will attach around the outer surface of a cancer cell in the blood. So here's a cancer cell trying to metastasize in your blood. It's looking for a new place to live. All right. And the immune system, normally natural killer cells will come along and they'll kill it. Okay. Because cancer cells will have molecules on their outer surface that are recognized as non-self. The immune system is pretty smart. But when this cancer cell is surrounded by activated platelets because too high dietary sodium intake, too much psychological stress activating the platelets, then they form a shield on the outer surface of the metastasized cell, and the immune system can't remove them. So not good. More metastatic cancer. Oh, this is a slide from Peter Quo. He's a cardiologist in Pennsylvania in the 1950s, and he fed patients. These are a bunch of cardiac patients with cardiac angina, so these are coronary patients. He fed them high-fat diets in a research setting, checked their blood lipids every 30 minutes, and what he found was during peak lipemia, which was typically, between about 4 to 7 hours, they had the most episodes of cardiac chest pain due to ischemia, lack of oxygen delivery because decreased oxygen being delivered by the blood at that moment. And was like, wow, that's pretty impressive. And that was back in the day when there was no angioplasty, no stenting, not a good way that he had to save those patients. He could inject them with IV heparin, but, dissolve the clots, but still not good. Anyways, later on, other researchers came along like Ray Rosenman, Meyer Friedman and stuff in the 1960s, two ophthalmologists, and they showed in the eye when you feed people high-fat diets, you get a diminished blood flow. And they also repeated it with Ansel Keys had shown that sat fat was a major cause of coronary artery disease back in the 1950s. And then people became kind of eager to try out PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, like the omega-6 fat cooking oils. And what they showed was that they cause an even more prolonged blood sludge. Like the research assistants would come in, at 8 o'clock in the morning and want to have the study done by 5 so they can go home. But the blood was still so thick, they had to stay late. So that pissed them off. They want overtime pay. And so what I'm trying to say is the PUFAs, omega-6s, were even worse than the saturated fat for causing prolonged blood sludge. Sometimes they'll also call rouleau formation, stack of coins in French. Okay, these are effects of high-fat meal. I'm not going to go into all this stuff, but there's a whole bunch of effects, and they're all bad. This is why I don't buy any of that stuff, because I know there's a lot of people around the internet trying to tell you, well, these are good fats, and these are bad fats. And I'm going to tell you, no, I disagree with that. I've read the work of Nathan Pritikin, John McDougall, and a whole bunch of papers on dietary lipids. There are no good fats. There are no good fats, okay? The little bit of omega-3s and omega-6s you get in plants, the essential fats, that's all you need. You don't need high-fat ones. Just eat regular plant foods. You get enough. That's worth knowing, okay? So you don't need to chase after all that stuff. I think that's a fool's errand. Okay, anyways, there's something that neutrophils, these are major immune cells, the most common one, they're like 60% of your white blood cells. They make something called MPO myeloperoxidase, which helps catalyze a reaction to produce hypochlorite, which is like bleach to kill bacteria. And they do some other things. So the reason I'm telling you this about neutrophils is that they become activated by eating high-fat meals, okay? So this is a real problem. High-fat meal will activate the NPs, the neutrophils. It will cause them to release myeloperoxidase. So here's a neutrophil. They're also called PMNs, polymorphonuclear, because they got a funny-looking nucleus. Leukocytes. Leukocyte means white blood cell. So they're going to release MPO, myeloperoxidase, which has a positive charge. So these are little red circles with a positive, a plus sign on there. And so those will hit the glycocalyx of the endothelium. EG is endothelial glycocalyx. And their positive charge will bind with the endothelial glycoprotein. So here's the glycoprotein, the core glycoprotein. Often it's something called syndecan-1. And then it has coming out of its side what are called glycosaminoglycans, and that's usually going to be something like heparin sulfate, chondroitin sulfate, and there's going to be a sialic acid at the tip of it, all negatively charged, which maintain a really big zeta potential. Well, anyways, the MPO screws it all up. The MPO causes the glycocalyx to collapse downward. Even some of the syndecans, these glycoproteins here, the base core protein is shed into the blood. So what this does then, you've got these binding proteins, it could be something like VCAM, vascular cell adhesion molecule. They're now exposed to the blood. Before they were hidden by all the negatively charged zeta potential stuff. And now when that collapses out, now the binding proteins are exposed. So the neutrophil can bind to the arterial wall. Not good. You don't want that. Okay. Your red blood cells can potentially stick to it and form a clot. So what I'm trying to say is these high-fat meals are screwing up your blood flow. By the way, just so you know, I did a fellowship at Harvard with the emphasis on vascular disease. Okay. I was a vascular interventional radiologist, meaning a endovascular surgeon. Okay. I did tons of balloon angioplasty and stenting of blood vessels, catheter thrombolysis. I was also trained in endovascular brain surgery, but I did not complete that fellowship. I only went 6 months into it and I stopped because neurosurgery had taken over the field. Okay, but I've done tons and tons of catheter arteriograms and arterial procedures and given tons and tons of lectures on it and written a bunch of book chapters, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what else has happened here? MPO myeloperoxidase binds red blood cells. It changes their shape. That's not good. It binds to endothelial cells. I talk about that, collapsing the endothelial glycocalyx. And it also causes shedding of the core protein syndecan-1. Okay, this is all bad. This is all the opposite of what you want happening. Here's another illustration from another paper. Syndecan-1 is just that core glycoprotein in the center, and these are the glycosaminoglycans bound to that, like the heparin sulfate. Again, the negative charges make them antithrombotic. The heparin sulfates, chondroitin sulfates, and the sialic acids at the tip. Okay, so here's what you normally have: this core glycoprotein sitting in the endothelial cells, plasma membrane, its outer surface. And when MPO gets involved, man, you just shed these things. They pop off because you freaked out the endothelial cell saying, oh, what's going on? I think there's an injury. We need to get ready to clot. And you're like, no, no, don't clot. But the endothelial cell doesn't understand. All it understands is blood flow, and the hypertension is confusing it, and the high fat is confusing it. So it releases its antithrombotic molecules, and now you're stuck with its prothrombotic molecules sitting in here, and your white blood cells are going to start binding to it, and so are your red blood cells. That's all bad. You're basically creating trouble for your body that should not exist. And the results of augmented leukocyte adhesion, meaning the white blood cells binding the arterial wall, is increased vascular permeability. Some of them will leak into the space underneath the epithelial lining, the endothelial lining, and more intravascular coagulation. Okay, so I want you to listen. They studied patients who had more of this shed glycoprotein in their blood that were admitted to the intensive care unit for infection. Some of them were sepsis, like heading into septic shock. And here's what they found. The more Syndecan was in the blood, the more likely the patient would just die. So what I'm saying is, do you really want to voluntarily cause more of this? Stupid. Once you understand, it's just stupid to do it. Okay, this is just another illustration, perhaps a little more detail. So here's your baseline with all these big Syndecan core proteins, part of the endothelial glycocalyx. And the glycocalyx is like a bunch of trees on a hill, okay? Like if you're flying in a helicopter, you look down at the hill, you see a bunch of trees on the surface of it. That's what they are. And they got all these negative charges on them, so nothing will stick to them. That's what you want. All right, so anyways, here's your baseline, happy, healthy endothelial glycocalyx. Glyco means sugar, calyx means coating, so it's like sugar coating. The reason they say sugar is the individual molecules of the side chain glycosaminoglycans are like sugars, okay? So anyways, they got all these negative charge and they repel all the problems. Yes, that's what you want. Okay, but when you have the high-fat meal activating the neutrophils and then they release their MPOs or myeloperoxidases, they trash the glycocalyx. They make the whole thing collapse down because they're very positively charged. It's very negatively charged. They just, get all happy and then collapse down. Okay, and then you start shedding your Syndecan glycoproteins into the blood, and now you expose all these adhesive molecules, things like vascular cell adhesive molecules, VCAM, et cetera, and the other ones. And now your white blood cells start sticking, red blood cells start sticking. You got a problem. Houston, we have a problem. So here's the mechanism of white blood cells sticking. First of all, they form a weak bond. They start rolling along the endothelial surface. They form a weak bond attached to it. And then they more and more sort of activate their receptors and form strong bonds. And then they can then even firmly adhere to the endothelial lining and squeeze between cells. There'll be a break in the tight junction, and they can get into the subendothelial space, subepithelial space, cause all kinds of problems, okay? So that's what it's all about. So a high-fat diet causes more myeloperoxidase in the blood. That is bad, bad, bad. These little positive charges are the MPO, the myeloperoxidase. And that screws up the zeta potential of the arterial lining and leads you to forming atherosclerosis, causing inflammation. It's all bad. The MPO also makes ROS, reactive oxygen species, and it also consumes your nitric oxide. It's all bad. It's like a little devil screwing up your artery. You don't want that. And it also can screw up the shape of your red blood cells. And what I'm trying to say is, if you add to this, the high-fat diets tend to be low in fiber, and so they're also associated with leaky gut. You get more LPS in the blood, the lipopolysaccharide, the gram-negative bacteria, endotoxin, and that's quite prothrombotic. People have formed, and also from viral infections, you'll become prothrombotic because that'll have a similar effect, causing something called amyloidogenic clotting. I'm not going to get into all the details of it. Just know it's prothrombotic. If you look at the heart, you ever heard of somebody with chest pain, obvious chest pain, cardiac disease, but they got a clean cardiac cath, clean coronary artery arteriogram? Because the major arteries that sit on the outer surface of the heart, the epicardial coronary, so that means the outer surface of the heart, the big ones, the left main, left anterior descending, left circumflex, right coronary. Those are the ones proximal. You could put a stent to them. You could bypass them. What I'm trying to say is those could be totally clean, but you could have problems in the small ones that penetrate into the cardiac muscle, the intramyocardial branches. And you could be filling them up with clots due to this LPS. You could be filling them up with clots due to viral infections. You could be filling them with clots due to this high-fat diet, this postprandial endotoxemia. And that could cause major problems with your heart. You can get something called syndrome X, coronary syndrome X. It's also more commonly caused nowadays microvascular angina. So now what I'm trying to say is you don't want this stuff. It's a problem. And I think it's also doing something similar in the brain. It can be slowly eroding brain function. So the holy grail of health is to get all this stuff right, like I talked, do all the positive stuff, avoid the negative stuff. And then I also jokingly say, this was King Arthur's round table, where he was with all his knights, and they wanted to seek the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail was the blood from the side of Christ when he was crucified, that is thought to have healing properties, can heal any wound. Okay, but in order to find the Holy Grail, the knight had to make himself worthy. And so what am I getting at with make yourself worthy? Like Sir Galahad. Sir Galahad was a knight who made himself worthy. Lancelot was the best knight, but Lancelot was, involved in risky business with Guinevere, so he was not worthy to find the Holy Grail. But Sir Galahad was pure and good. So what am I getting at? The people who get healthy are the ones who think biblically. Thou shalt not eat meat. Thou shalt not eat dairy. Thou shalt not eat oil. They make a big change and they have a big improvement. Whereas in my experience, most people are kind of half-butt. Well, I'm cutting down on oil. I'm cutting down on meat. I'm cutting down on processed food. They make a little progress and then they're not that motivated, maybe a little. They usually don't get too far. I know a lot of people like that who initially they went 100%, had a big weight loss and big improvement, and then they drifted back into their old habits, and then they have bad outcomes: myocardial infarctions, kidney failure, heart attacks, strokes. Okay, so here's the diet. I call this the Spartan vegan diet. This kind of goes to my background. I was a former wrestler, and it's a real Spartan and simple. There's other names you can call it. It's basically about the same thing as the other low-fat vegan community eats. People like Jeff Nelson, John McDougall, Esselstyn, Chef AJ, and the other low-fat vegans. There's actually not that many of them. There's a lot more high-fat vegans or moderate-fat vegans than there are low-fat vegans, but low-fat vegan is better for multiple reasons. So anyways, here it is. Just eat starches to satisfy your hunger and fruits, and then throw in some veggies for additional nutrients. Probably will need a vitamin B12. I like methylcobalamin. Get all your psychological stuff fixed and as good as you can get it, and that's about the best you can do. Oh, and keep your brain smart. I'll just show you one last thing for fun. This is what I call the magic bathroom. I had read an article about Mozart, and Mozart used to write letters when he's on the toilet on the loo, and he would write, I think it only fitting to write while shitting. And I said to myself, well, gee, I could read a book while I'm there, okay? Because I always was pressed for time, but I wanted to read more. So I keep a paperback up here. I usually have a big textbook here. For number twos, I'll read the textbook. For number ones, I'll read the paperback. I never go into the bathroom. I never go in and exit the bathroom without having read a page of something. And I usually complete an entire book in a given week. Usually, if it's a longer book, it might take 2 weeks, but most of the time I'll complete a book in a weekend, in a week. And then I listen to an audiobook in the car. So I'm always reading. Every week, I automatically read 2 books. And then I do additional reading, so it usually ends up being significantly more than that. And then this was when I was studying for my neuroradiology boards the first time around. I had all these things. And of course, you can imagine, this is at my old house. This was in the basement. My wife was quite embarrassed by my behavior and would not want a guest to ever come in there. But I thought it was great. Anything I had to memorize, I would just see the picture and then I close my eyes and I describe it accurately, and that's how I would do it. And I put pictures of my heroes on the wall. By the time I made this, I actually had a picture of Esselstyn on the wall in there somewhere, I think. Anyway, the magic bathroom, it really helped me a lot for school. Let's see what else. Not in school and for life. That's how I read so much, because I still work full time. I'm a full-time clinical doctor. I wish I had more time. I wish there was some research institute that would hire me to do research. I want to do research. It's kind of, I've already read a bazillion brain MRIs. I could do that in my sleep. It's time for me to read. I need more time to read these papers. Okay, so anyways, but no one cares. No one cares about the patients. You guys are the pros, useless eaters, okay? Then no one cares about you. Unless they can sell you a drug and make money about you, no one cares about you. If you think they do, then you're a chump. Okay, so this is like, how do you live healthy? Like Adam and Eve. Eating plant foods, Genesis 1:29, every fruit-bearing plant on the earth shall be food for you. And, you live simply. Avoid all these chemicals and stuff. None of them are good for you. I like this painting. This is the Adam and Eve version by Jan Bruegel and Peter Paul Rubin. It's my favorite Adam and Eve painting. So anyways, I hope that's helpful. That's it.
Thank you very much, Peter. This was a great presentation and important, a lot of wonderful information. To the audience, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, share it, give it the thumbs up, subscribe here, and go subscribe to Dr. Rogers. That's it for today. See you on the next one. Thanks.